ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting episode of Loss of Lieutenant. Tonight I am joined by some amazing special guests who you'll hear about in a little bit. But tonight we are talking about probably the second most important thing aside from taking some models, and that is terrain. We've hit a new edition, so we are thinking it's time to teach you all how to make some amazing Australian tables and not have to play on some shitty American ones. Before we get into all that, we do have a little bit of housekeeping to start with. We have our quarterly challenge, which is N5 first impressions. So we want bat reps of your first game. We want bat reps after a few games. And we'd love to have your most creative use of sandtrap terrain, which is going to be a little bit relevant to this subject. Send all your submissions to lossoflieutenant@gmail.com. Also, a quick reminder that you have until the 5th of December to send us your lists for Pimp My List CanCon edition. So get those in as well. We've had quite a few submissions already. Upcoming events, obviously, is CanCon, the Infinity Nationals for Australia. I don't think it's the 25th and the 26th. I think it's actually the 26th and the 27th. That might be a mistake. It's the Saturday and Sunday of the Australia Day long weekend. The missions are acquisition, unmasking, supplies, firefight, and decap, and tickets are still available to my best knowledge. Now, do you want to build a table? I am joined today by two of Australia's most decorated table builders. We have Hugh, the friendliest man alive. You might know him from the Burn City Brawl streams. And I believe winner of best table twice in a row with the same table.
Not quite.
Not quite?
Voted best table twice, but even better than winning the second time, that table was disqualified and disbarred from future best table comps. Which, if you check, the reason they have that warning is me.
Excellent. And our second special guest, we are joined by Luke, who I think has more top tables in two-day events than any other person I've ever met, and is a connoisseur and collector of fine tables marked with the Henry label.
Thanks, Tristan. Yeah, I won't claim it's all down to me. I'm a partnership with my brother Peter, and together we work on a lot of tables together. These days, I prefer to spend my hobby time on painting terrain than actual miniatures. So that's where I come into it.
I've heard from Peter that you guys have more tables in storage than you've actually built, which is rather scary.
Yeah. I think Pete's got a couple of Bunnings tubs of flat pack MDF that we've purchased with expectation that we can get it to the table. But these days with two little kids, both of us are a little bit time poor.
Excellent, excellent. So you've got a lot to build on. I can't wait to see.
I think at the moment, between Peter and I, we've probably got about 8 tables.
Built or in flat pack?
Built, and we've probably got another, I don't know, I'd say 4 thereabouts in flat pack. Yeah.
Peter was going more 10, but I'll believe you.
Maybe.
I'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
I don't tend to stretch the terrain as far as he does.
Well, we'll have to see. We'll have to see how that plays out in a minute. We do have everyone's tables on here, which is very lovely. We are going to start. So this for anyone watching, the first little bit of this is going to be for the complete N5 newbie. You've just picked up the game. You have no idea what you're doing. We're going to give you the knowledge you need to have fun and have a good game. Then we're going to move on to what more of these guys' specialities, where they spend weeks and months planning tables. I remember spending a night with Hugh at probably the previous CanCon, and she was dream talking about jungle tables and Morat-themed things and all that, which we'll get to see later as well. So, step 0. What's the point of playing the game? We're here to have fun. And what's part of that? The table. So, it's all about having the best experience possible. And the table is very important for that. So we want to reward engagement and not punish failure. And we don't want to lock our friends into a bad time. So if you see a bad table, make it again.
And I think to develop on that a little bit, it's about approaching the task of assembling, constructing, planning a table to facilitate people having a good time.
Yep.
Absolutely. And a key part of that is about setting a scene and creating an environment where people want to engage in the game, have interesting interactive experiences with the Infinity rule set in a way that the terrain facilitates, and ideally have it in a space where the theme is quite engaging. I kind of think of it as striking a balance between setting up a chessboard and setting up a movie set. So creating that space where people want to interact, feel engaged with the rule set, always feel like they're a part of the game and participating and don't feel closed out, because that can certainly be some of the issues you see, particularly with very open tables or poorly set up tables.
Yeah. I think one of the big pulls of Infinity when you see it at a con or you see it pictures online is the tables are built up and gorgeous and beautiful. And it's very different for other games. Other games, some have 2D flat terrain, 40k has a standard layout, so the terrain might look amazing, but it's always going to be in the same spot. Whereas Infinity, the tables can be completely out there, and it's really up to the mind's imagination to create what you want to create.
It's such a visual game that the setup and the platform that you provide for players becomes such a part of their experience, and I think really differentiates what can be a very ordinary experience versus one that can be quite cinematic. But for someone starting out, I appreciate your budget and maybe you're just getting into the game. So the CB card terrain does a great job of getting you to the table and getting things set up in a way that's really interesting and facilitates those early steps of playing the game.
Absolutely. All right. So we've established that we want to have fun. We're going to do the real beginner stuff. So the basic structure. This is me. I'm not sure about you guys, but when I go to make a table, I grab my big buildings and my buildings in general, and I'm going to chuck that down first. I'm going to keep in mind what the amount of fire lanes and the size of the fire lanes that I want. So I'm very much a person who likes more medium-ish fire lanes. I don't like a bunch of long fire lanes, but you definitely want to have a mix. Infinity really loves variety of terrain height, so I love going 3 stories plus. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be 3 full stories, but so long as there's variation in height at least more than twice, I think that's really beneficial. And sightlines. Sometimes you chuck stuff on the table and you only look at it from one direction, and then you look at it from the side and you go, oh no. Horizontally, I can see, the whole table all the way through, and that's going to be real much of a pain in the ass. So three things I think are very important for beginners to consider. What do you guys think? Oh, Hugh, you're muted.
I am. I had a sip of a drink just before. I think that enfilading fire, like horizontally, as you're calling it, like that through your deployment zone, it has ended, I would say, more than one of my first 10 games, and probably not too many subsequent games. So that's a lesson you learn quickly in deployment, but the table layout really does make a major difference there.
Yep.
How many buildings do you reckon you'd want on
the table?
On a table, yeah.
For a standard, if a standard building is, let's say, 6x6, something like that. Yep. For a CB, let's say for a CB card table, I'd probably say 6 or 7 big ones, and then maybe 4 medium and 4 small, something like that. It ends up building out to about bare minimum 4 sets of CB terrain, I want to say.
Yeah, I think I've got 5 on my card table, but it's probably overkill to have all 5 on.
Yep, so I've got a little picture here of when Luke and I went to James's house yesterday. And this was the original this was the basic structure. This is what I put down, and I went, cool. This is what I'm looking at. And then I started looking around the table, and I went, oh no, that's a bit open, eh? Anything on the 16-inch line is kind of going to get shot. So that's kind of what I'm meaning with these horizontal fire lanes, in that maybe you want something either a building, or if you're going to plan to block it up later with like a big piece of scatter, but you probably want to somehow cut that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even offsetting that little orange building,
yes,
such that it cuts that line a little bit.
Yeah, and just to keep in mind as well, you can see in the bottom DZ here, it's important to have a building that cuts the DZ down the length, so something touching the back of the DZ line. Otherwise, a drop troop, potentially with a Spitfire, if it gets a niche position or whatever, is just going to melt your DZ, and it's not going to be good times. I think that's a good, fairly common rule in Australia, I want to say.
Yeah, I like to think of it as you should have at least one and possibly two pieces of terrain touching the back line, and ideally protruding further forward than standard deployment zones at the back of buildings. And that just creates the opportunity for troops to come in and engage on a flank, but not be able to sweep directly through and clear out all of the flash pulse bots and all that sort of thing that sits there juicily providing those orders.
Yeah.
Yeah, the aspiration, I reckon, is that it's not that your deployment zone has just been dropped whole cloth onto the environment, but rather integrates into it.
Yep.
If we want to get thematic with it.
So we identified this problem and fixed it. Step 2. So once you've put all your buildings down, you should really focus on your deployment zone. Infinity is one of the only games you're going to play, especially as a new player, where you can lose in deployment. And sometimes the table can really precipitate that. So both DZs should have enough terrain to comfortably place 15 models, including a tag. Having a tag shouldn't really deteriorate from your ability to put down some S2s or anything like that. Think about the deployment of HVTs and make sure both sides at least have one decent spot. It really sucks. I know everyone here's probably played a game where they've taken a side and they go, where do I put my HVT? And the only place you can really put it is like 20 plus. And you're like, kind of feels bad.
If unmasking is in the tournament lineup, you've got to be really careful.
If unmasking is in the tournament, you really actually have to dedicate a lot of thought to every player needs 3 HVT spots.
Yeah.
Well,
which is
a good way. At least two.
At least 2.
What I sort of always encourage, particularly when I'm setting up my table for a tournament, is I'll always put down any objectives and set them up on the table first before I place any of my buildings, and use that as an opportunity to sort of create the space. And then as part of that, you're thinking about locations for HVTs, and particularly where unmasking is a factor. Yeah, making sure that you've got some defensible positions, but maybe not necessarily always equal.
Not equal, yes. It's probably a good idea to have one side have more advantageous positions than the other side. Unmasking is a big one, because if the first player has the same defensive opportunities as the second player, it can almost feel a bit unfair. Likewise with HVTs, if you're playing TAC or Shaz or something like that, ensure there's enough spots to place, 3 or 4 camo markers from 16 to 24. Some factions really rely on them for their defensive structure, almost the same as some factions rely on hard ARO pieces for their defensive structure. So you can bolster up the DZ, but if TAC is forced to deploy near their DZ with their camo, they've almost, lost 10 to 15% of the value of their army just by not being allowed to extend themselves.
Yeah, you definitely want to give people a chance to leverage the points they've spent on their models.
Yeah, it's all about opportunities, really.
I think one of the interesting pieces when you're setting up deployment is looking for ways in which you can create defensive space, particularly for someone who has lost a role and ended up going second, or maybe because of the mission has opted into second. to ensure that any sort of really strong alpha attack isn't going to totally erode and lose them the game from turn one. Likewise, flipping it around, when you're talking about things like high points and table cover, making sure you don't have really, really high dominating sniper positions in deployment zones, and looking for ways in which, ideally, if there are elevated positions, because there still should be the opportunity for defensive snipers to have a play in the game, but that their vision across the table is segmented down to slices that create a puzzle for the opponent.
Yep.
Your defensive
sniper.
Sorry, you go.
I always have the view that if there's a sniper alley, that there should be at least a pathway that is close to or near to it, that you can engage a sniper at shotgun range with the proper delivery of orders of a trooper. So if you can sort of strike that balance and make sure you've got that pathway there, I think that can help alleviate the feels bad experience of having, a black air just sitting there watching your list, and you've brought a list without a sufficient punchy gun.
Yep.
Yeah, the sniper shouldn't be able to insist on fights out of 32.
Yeah, the real feels bad is when you go to a tournament and you play against an ALF player and they have Atalanta and you get a couple bad rolls and you go, well, I'm going to coordinate order you with SMGs now because that's what I've got. And you're like, this is a shit game.
From 30 inches away.
Yeah, like it's definitely not the good experience. So there should always be the ability to either cautious move or spend the orders, even if it's order intensive, there should be the option to do that.
And play into things like smoke and the like, so that there's opportunities to block line of sight, but also for those factions that don't have smoke, cautious moves or ways in which they can angle their way forward.
Yeah,
it's interesting. The density piece becomes a bit of a conversation here, particularly if you're tight on budget. Trying to find ways in which you can increase density to make the game and bring the table up to a playable state is really important. And that can be something as simple as buying extra CB card sets, or even just using more simple, scratch-built terrain, getting sort of plastic lunch boxes that you can rattle can grey, and that'll give you at least enough of a barrier and some interesting terrain for the table that can get you playing games sooner.
Yeah. We kind of alluded to it earlier, but there should be slight imbalances between both deployment zones. So, i.e., better ARO spots, better objective placements, or better ARO potential on those objectives, stronger positions for tags, etc., etc. It really makes the choice between first turn and second turn or first turn and deployment order more of a choice rather than, new edition, snap pick first, always. Yeah. What do you guys think?
That's the N5 hot take, isn't it?
Go first. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. You can sometimes with CB card terrain kind of make both DZs feel the same. There are ways around it. You've got like the sniper towers. You've got, maybe put a little bit less scatter in one DZ than the other kind of thing.
I think to make the CB terrain work, there's a couple of quick tips you can do to sort of get it singing. That is probably look at the ways in which you angle your stairwells. Stairwells that face backwards mean that people exiting the buildings have to walk backwards to go forwards.
Yep.
So either having them facing forwards but sideways means that people can get down quickly and makes them more order efficient. I'm a big fan of bridges. I think tables should encourage the use of bridges. They provide an opportunity to advance undercover from things that are side on, which can mean you have the opportunity to push forward and create engagements that, if people aren't careful, either it can overpower an ARO or allow a piece to get forward quickly.
Yep.
So looking at ways to leverage that, I think, is really key. I know the bridges don't come in the base set. I don't believe. I think
they do.
They
come in the objective room set, I believe.
Yeah, the expansion set.
Yep. You should have a balance between those sets, by the way. because the objective rooms are essential if you're going to have a table. And that set also comes with a sniper tower, which gives you a different layer of height as well, which is nice. So even if you get one of those, because you only need one objective room, you can flip the objective room and just make it a big 8x8 building and kind of stack on top of that as well. Yeah, they're definitely useful as well.
Yeah, I'd almost go as far as say 2 of those kits would be good.
Well, I mean, 4's the minimum. 5, 6 is kind of, I have options now. I can play with it a little bit kind of thing. I can make something a little bit different. So this is what I would say is probably the bare minimum amount of terrain you want in a deployment zone if you're running CB card terrain. So the way people do it is a lot different. I have things like touching buildings, so you can vault up here. As Luke alluded to, I have some of the staircases facing outwards, so it's easier. It's not feels bad, man. I have to spend a whole lot to jump off the building or whatever. I can move forward. And then you want scatter touching the buildings really, so that you create more of those nooks and that kind of thing, not just across the ways, but also vertically. So you can cut the
vertical to allow sort of prone deployment and stop that flanking fire from wiping out your valuable orders.
Yeah. So if anyone watching, this is probably what I would say would be the bare minimum. You can absolutely go more than this. For some people, it might even look a little bit naked, but yeah, this is what we played. I played on this table yesterday, and it played pretty well. So, all right.
I like what you've done there with the touching buildings, Tristan, as well. And I certainly in my evolution of table design, we'll cover off in a little bit later, but some of my early iterations, focused on having singular buildings blocking together and having sort of avenues around those buildings.
Yep.
But you can create really interesting spaces to engage in gunfights by touching buildings together. And particularly for the CB terrain, it can be quite square or rectangular. And so touching 2 buildings together can create more of irregular shaped buildings, still at right angles, which I find an easier way to play.
Yeah.
But means that you can create sort of defensive positions and opportunities for interesting engagements.
Absolutely. All right. Part 3, scatter. I should have got that GIF where the guy's just throwing crap on the table. All right. Make sure you have plenty of scatter terrain. It is literally the non-oil of table design. If your table is kind of mid, more scatter is just going to make it better. Scatter, this is what you guys mentioned as well. Scatter should be placed in a way that allows models to chain their way across the table reliably. Realistically, unless you're actively choosing to do so, most engagements you should have the option of cover.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there's no cover, I think a lot of probably your high-level competitive experts can make it work, but someone who's at my level is just going to go, oh, I might just not have a turn if I'm taking fights out of cover.
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think scatter does a number of things. It can help break up and create that irregular building framework that I was talking about earlier, and break up the natural squares or rectangles that a lot of either CB or laser cut terrain have. But it also means, a big part of the game is sort of this engagement and calculated odds type of approach. And so having tables without a lot of scatter then really reduces your opportunity to sort of actively engage with that odds adjustment effective.
To extend that theme out of like adjusting odds, the exchange of resources is really critical as well. And having scatter that lets you, okay, I can't win that gunfight. I guess we're belly crawling for 10 orders, but that if there's enough scatter, and I view this as a threshold of enough and not enough. If you can't spend time and move safely, you could do with more scatter. Because if my opponent has spent 10 orders dodging my Suriyat heavy rocket launcher, then bloody fantastic.
Yes, but if it
I think
gives
scatter's...
Sorry, go on.
Well, I think scatter's where tables can fall down quite quickly. That's probably the big one that
Yes.
comes out. That yeah, if you're forced in that situation where you're belly crawling or you're looking at the table and you don't have an opportunity to push into an ARO, a hard ARO, and tilt the odds in your favour, then that says something about the table. It can say something about your list.
Yep.
But it can also say something about the table.
It isn't something you're going to fix by putting more buildings down. There is a prerequisite amount of buildings or big terrain, and there is a prerequisite amount of scatter, because they both serve different purposes and are both incredibly important to the experience. So you're not going, I don't really like how scatter looks. It makes it look anti-thematic or something like that. You can chuck more buildings down if you want. It's going to start playing like a grid. It's going to be really weird.
And it's past a point, it also becomes physically quite difficult to play on a table that is all buildings. Think about the distance from the first joint of your thumb through the first joint of your pinky. That's about the space that there should be between buildings so that you can go in and move that 15 mil token rather than just sort of, drop a wound marker into that objective room and hope that it correctly tracks the game state.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think to me, scatter is so critically important, but you can go overboard. But I see very, very few tables where it does go overboard. I tend to take the view when I'm building my tables that I tend to space scatter probably 4 to 6 inches apart. And to me, that strikes a balance between creating opportunities where people have to sort of push, but you can still do things like cautious move or short crawls that will get you to a position to advance to the next piece of cover if you need to. The danger of going closer than that is A, you need a lot of scatter to make it work, and B, it then tends to clutter the table, which can make it. I have a big focus on sort of cognitive load. So to me, a really well played table is one that, at a glance, when you're under pressure, you're round 4 of a 5-round tournament. Maybe had a few beers, and you're trying to sort of figure out how to make the right approach. It should be somewhat readily apparent with a little bit of experience as to what your path forward is.
You want the scatter to be there when you reach for it, rather than go, well, actually, which of these 6 pieces is the right one? Because probably 4 of them are wrong.
Yeah. It's very easy with card terrain to pop down so much scatter that it starts turning into a maze. And an S2 marker walking along the ground is only ever going to engage with something when it's prone within 3 inches.
Oh, yeah. And please consider for a moment the humble Magariba and its smaller cousin, the baggage bot. There was a year, time is a flat circle, but it was a number of CanCons ago, and I had this, it was the mission, Dante's mission about getting fed into the wood chipper.
Yep.
And I had this foolproof plan mapped out, synchronized, getting 2 baggage bots up in the first turn, and the table had these little alleyways with scatter in them that meant there was simply no way for that 55 mil base with a 4-inch move to possibly clear it. It's well, that's one, a table read issue on my part, because I just assumed that the table would be playable.
Yeah.
But then also it is a legitimate obstruction for some, only baggage bots really, and Andromeda, I suppose.
But it's probably detrimental in general. If you can have 1 piece of scatter in that little alleyway, you don't need 3 chained together or anything like that.
No, it was not how I would have hoped to end the weekend. It was a little bit frustrating.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
I think 55 mil bases are a challenge, always a challenge, and the Maggie.
And they should be challenging, but they shouldn't be a lockout. You are making trades. And that 55 mil base or 80 mil base is a downside, but it should be hard, not impossible.
Absolutely.
So things like locations to deploy in total cover for those large bases is important.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our final table. I added some bridges and some stairs and just threw some scatter in general. We can see the fire lanes are kind of broken up by, I don't know what you call them, the little triangle things of that nature. But there is still like some long fire lanes, like at the very bottom through to the DZ. You can cover that decently well with snipers and that kind of thing. Like, there is opportunities to use your really long range ARO pieces. There is, very specifically, if you'll notice, a piece of scatter on top of this building, so a tag can never sit there.
Jordan, I can't fit my cutter up there. What are you talking about?
I mean,
That's perfect suppression range for the cutter.
Yeah.
watching for zones, high point zones where tags can deploy is a huge thing, and certainly probably more in N4 when you had things like the Zeta climbing up the side of buildings and getting just really weird angles.
Yes.
To close opponents out. Yeah,
yes. If there is something like that, and Zeta has climbing plus and pays for it, but if it's shooting at you, it shouldn't be getting cover. If it's on a weird, stupid angle. So I played this game against James's Yujing, my first game of N5. And James managed to use the table much better than me and pull the draw.
I probably would say, Tristan, being a harsh critic, that the bottom deployment zone needed probably one building on the baseline.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, this isn't. It's sideways. It's side on.
Oh, it is sideways.
No, this isn't the DZ.
Okay.
Oh, can you see?
I would still probably dissect it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you go for it. This, for anyone watching, this is a representation of what I consider the minimum to be.
Yeah.
The absolute minimum.
Yeah.
Have thoughts though.
You've got a good mix of density there. You've got some interesting spaced out cover that covers both vertical and horizontal. Bridges that allow you to push forward from one building to another, undercover, advance up and down buildings quickly, and create a space where you can engage in both long and short range gunfights as you pick.
I like sort of looking at this, I see that it sort of maps almost onto a grid, even though those gridded sight lines are broken up. And I think that's a good way to think about planning your own tables, dear listener, in that you should be having some reflection on, okay, if someone's deployed here, what's their moving forward plan? If someone realizes they're running out of orders and they've got two or three orders to pull back from this zenith of their attack run, where do they go? Where does someone take cover for the turn in the midfield? And thinking about blocks of space and how those blocks interact is part of my methodology, at least.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely tell you that the little nook between the center building and the sniper tower, James had a hack tower in there, and due to the amount of orders it would take me to move around, it was quite difficult to dislodge. So things like that, players that recognize, oh, look, here's a really good spot, I can sit here, and giving them the opportunity to do that. Whereas if James instead even if he put his hack tower more back behind the little triangle thing, it would have been easier for me to get to.
Yeah. Because you're able to slice the pie from further away.
Absolutely. Yep. All right. The do nots of table building. This is a very personal one to me and Jordan. Cylinders are not infinity friendly at all and are not very great at reducing that cognitive load on players. There was a time, I can't remember if it was N3 or N4, where touching a cylinder gave you cover from like more than 180 degrees for some reason. Like you'd cover completely forward, but it was a cylinder, and it was kind of stupid and didn't make sense. So just throw cylinders in the bin. We don't need them unless they have like stuff sticking out of them.
Yeah, I agree with that. The game really plays well where there's flat surfaces for models to touch up against, and it reduces the friction between players. A big part of what makes a really great game of Infinity is this idea of interaction between the players, the fact that you can play a game with someone that you don't know, and the table state should make it really readily apparent, even if you haven't had a conversation as to where a model's getting cover and maybe isn't. And cylinders can make that a more difficult conversation. You don't always get games against Hugh. You sometimes have to play against
You?
really tough, challenging opponents.
Yes.
Luke consistently ranks in my towards the top of my sports card.
100%.
I think the thing is that yes, Infinity is broadly basic geometry, but that we as adults mostly aren't doing geometry that's all that complex in our daily life. I think Infinity is where I do most of my geometry, and that's having one circle that is the silhouette of your model moving in an otherwise corner-based space. Having two circles interacting, especially once you add vertical difference into it, it begins to approach, as I understand it, undergraduate calculus, which I have no interest in understanding, lest it be.
Shouldn't be a chore. It should be
No.
really easy to play at the table. Yeah.
Absolutely.
No one has to be here, as we said on slide 0.
Yeah.
We kind of talked a little bit about it before, but tags should not be allowed to use their height advantage to see entire tables. So basically, the top layer of your terrain, you want to ban tags from it. Unless, unfortunately, it's a Zeta and it's climbing up, but even in that case, it's not getting cover. You don't want a tag to be allowed to retain cover at the highest point, because that will just be a very unfun experience.
I think that's really important, and it doesn't have to necessarily block them, I would say, in terms of having them deployed there, but using ways in which you can use building shadows to create space where tags don't have full visibility across tables is really important.
Yes.
I think, it always pays once you set up the table to, grab one of your larger silhouettes, place them around, particularly on those higher buildings, and just make sure that there's pathways around the table that allow an opponent to advance under the oppressive fire of a tag. What the worst experience you can have is, say, maybe going second, having suffered an alpha and not been able to effectively defend against it, and then have an opponent park a tag, in a really dominant position. And if you've lost your key pieces that can engage that tag, then you've got 3 turns of nothing really. That can be a really demoralizing sort of experience. So table design should eliminate that, and allow an opponent who maybe through their own deployment not help themselves, but maybe has lost a lot of orders or lost a few key attack pieces early in the game, still has an opportunity to participate in the mission and maybe score some points. I think that's, to me, that is a critical part of table design that we can help enable.
Well,
yes.
While we're on the don'ts slide, it's really simple. Just use terrain zone rules. Everything that's not the ground is a biotech war zone. Perfect. We're done.
Specifically for tags.
No, everyone. Everyone.
Okay. There you go. We're playing the air is lava.
Yeah. Yes.
And this is one you mentioned, Hugh. Trying to be truly representative of terrain will make you go mad very quickly. Use rules, for example, sat zones and low vis, to represent large bushes and trees instead of true line of sight. I feel like anyone who tries to represent trees as true line of sight will play 30 minutes of a game and go, no, this is silly.
Well, not least because tree trunks tend to be approximately circular, as we've just discussed. I think the other thread that I was thinking of is interiors, where I find the interiors on my tables tend to be very sparse, barren, deserted. But I've tried once or twice to have doll's house furniture style stuff, and it's just, this is a diorama. This is not playable because there's no. Yeah, sure, I've got the table and the chairs and the lockers and the litter. None of it leaves space for an S2 model, let alone an S4 model. And so rather than having the chaos of a upturned barracks directly modeled on the table. You go, all right, it's a sat zone, it's a low visibility zone, maybe it's the power banks of a generator and its albedo or something. But that sort of, rather than trying to be directly representative, there's all this cool rules technology you can use.
Yep. It's almost like if you had a military barracks with bunk beds and then you had them stacked 4 in a row or whatever, you're like, do they block line of sight? Can I see through the bottom? Can I see your base when you're pro?
Yeah.
Is the whole thing solid? In which case it's just like having, 8 bookshelves in a room, which seems a bit weird. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is that a lot of that, like, I've tried to do a barracks room, and there's a shoebox of just junk that is on my shelf somewhere. The thing is, a lot of that, like, lockers make for terrible terrain because they don't actually complicate any lines of sight. There's no interesting engagements enabled by that piece. It's just that this wall is extra thick.
Yep. And it just looks pretty.
Ish. I'm not very good at painting.
Well, looks more interesting, more thematic. Yeah. So
look, I have an interesting piece which I say I tend to not use interiors, and partly because I find them, if you've got to lift buildings up or lift levels off, that's automatically a problem.
Yeah.
The few interior tables that I've seen work, Pete does a really good one with our Knights of Dice Chinatown table. I know that can be a polarizing table for some people to play on, but he essentially plays the second story is accessible, so there's actually no roof on the building.
I can.
I've seen that
quickly.
In one of Rob's videos. Talked about that as what they do in the Canberra meta as well. So it gives it.
Yeah.
It's not just ground level windows, and so it provides that sense of isolation from the bustling throng on street level that you do want from a second story building, without the. And I agree. Never, if you're moving terrain, something's gone wrong.
Yeah.
Because obviously one hopes that one is always playing an opponent in a fun, chill game that has the spirit of truth and competitiveness at its heart. But the temptation is best not put on the table, if you'll pardon the pun.
For sure.
So this table has other problems, but what it does do very well is it takes the rooftops off, it treats the buildings as infinitely tall, and it lets you play
the Tristan.
The stream will see it.
This is Callum's one?
This is Peter's Chinatown table. And it has the rooftops off, and it is infinitely tall. And it plays that really well. It lets you use the interiors without feeling like you're going to break the table almost. It is a good idea. I don't have a photo of Callum's, but Callum's is a great example of a table that uses the interiors of buildings really well. Almost so that I think one time we were playing that table and we went, let's just take all the rooftops off and just play it like that. Because it just seemed, it opened up the amount of spots. It kind of made it more dense in the sense I have more spots to deploy as well. But made it simpler to play because, there is one floor and there was a little bit of things on the side, but it was really great because it simplified lines of fire because there weren't any rooftops and everything was infinitely tall.
Yeah.
Which was
that's the challenge with rooftops, particularly that, like, if they're all similar levels, like those Knights of Dice buildings, you end up creating this very sort of two-plane game where you've got everyone on the ground and then everyone on the roof, and everyone on the roof sees everyone else on the roof.
Exactly. Yeah.
Experience. So
that's why I would suggest 3 layers of height for anyone making a table. They don't have to be one over the other. They can be like 1, 1.5, 2, but so long as there is a variance there, that's good. Quickly, we were talking about cylinders before. Jordan and I played our Border Bash table, not to kick anyone's table into the dirt, but this table drove us crazy. So firstly, cylinders. It had a crap load of cylinders. And in the deployment zone as well, which made it very difficult to hide certain things without being seen from quite long distance angles. Secondly, this has pretty much no scatter if you consider the scatter to be smaller than the fighter jet. So Jordan went first and absolutely smashed me. And thirdly, which I think Luke mentioned as well in our little document, is that these massive centerpieces really forced me to have to deal with Jordan's tag in one or two directions. And I only had that small alley to actually put stuff. So Jordan popped his tag back here. I either shoot it from here or I shoot it from here. And it was incredibly predictable. And we played it so that we didn't even know if you could be on top of these or not. So, yeah.
So you deployed on the right-hand side of the picture?
I deployed here.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, God, where do I deploy? I pretty much had here to deploy Link, and then stuff was scattered out here. Which...
Yeah.
I also played this table at Border Bash.
Same. I enjoyed it, but I played round 4, which I might have benefited from both of your feedback, and therefore Val and I had a very rigorous conversation about how to play it before we deployed. But sorry, Luke, I jumped in.
Yeah, I actually played the owner of the table on it.
Yeah, okay.
And we played that large center point, as inaccessible on top.
Yep.
With the other two mounds were accessible. And short move skill between door and roof for the buildings.
Yep.
Look, it played okay. I also had the right-hand side deployment with the fighter jets. And I mean, it was a bit of a funny one because I was playing Bakunin into French. And
yes.
had more of a sniper. So how that interplayed is always interesting. But I found it a clean table to play on, in a sense of, even though there were round objects, because of the lower level of scatter, and the relative density of the buildings on the table, it played okay. But it definitely was one of those ones where I walked up to the table and thought, oh shit, where am I going here? And how am I going to tackle this?
Yes. Yeah. I think it might have been the other extreme for you. I'm playing against Jordan's Vanilla Combined. For anyone who doesn't know, Jordan won the tournament, and he was playing probably the best faction in the game. So his opportunities...
he doesn't muck about.
He
No.
As we would say in Australia, and pardon my French, he doesn't fuck around.
Yeah.
So he got first turn, big old snap pick immediately, and I'm sitting here going, right, either I chuck stuff on a row and it dies to his tag, or I hide it and I see what happens. If I hide it, Jordan shoots some pitches to from a point I can't see to a point that doesn't matter, and guided everything. And that's kind of what happened. Yeah, I felt like I had very little recourse. Even the bottom half. So the only height I really get are these two buildings.
Yeah.
Which only covers slight amount of the table. I can't deploy on a fighter jet, retain cover, and cover this advance below, which was where his Samaritan came from. I had to hide stuff and just hope that the Samaritan doesn't run into CC and eat it to death.
I was able to use those fighter jets to deploy a hacking network and try and cover the attack of anyone coming down that sort of bottom flank.
Similarly.
And I think that was probably my only way of really working it, because it was, it creates a real opportunity. You don't really have any great way of covering off that access point between that center building and the wreckage that's there.
Yep.
Without deploying a model with that sort of far top right building.
Yep.
Just play Tohar and run a delegate.
That's it.
Sure.
even from this spot here, there is a way that you can use the center cylinder to block your view here, and then you're getting in. And if you're getting in here, you're probably getting in within 16 to shoot whatever aero piece that is. But even if you do that, the big F-off combined army tag is going to shoot you before you do that. Yeah, so Jordan had this side. Jordan really disliked these. He didn't like the cylindrical pyramid things. And these are putting two cylinders together is kind of,
It just makes a square. Or rectangle, sorry.
all these circles make a square.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say this is a problem of not enough scatter, and basically a quarter of my, or half my deployment zone doesn't have a building.
I would say
Yeah.
so I deployed on that side as well. I definitely we played the planes as just total cover, like to their fullest vertical extent.
Yep.
And so there was like stuff to just have things to cower behind for total cover. But I would say it's fully 2/3 of that back table edge for the player deploying on the right. Yeah, it's definitely a table with some structural concerns, but I don't know. I had a good game on it, and I think with what this table perhaps most of all needs is printout for here's how you play this idiosyncratic table.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's a big one, Hugh. You know, if you've got odd tables, I personally didn't hate the table, but I did find it a challenging one to observe, particularly because of the way my brain works. And I look at it, there's lots of different angles. There's circular objects, there's irregular shapes. They're all slightly off alignment, and then there's some big gaps there between it. It could either benefit from a couple of extra buildings, particularly on that right-hand side, and some smaller scatter, I think, would just help create more interaction points. But a guide to how to play the table would really, really be helpful.
Yep.
Well, I think I would venture that this might be a table that's run the risk of trying to be too representative rather than indicative.
Yep.
And so you've got what is a very busy runway, but a pretty uncomfortable infinity table.
Sometimes there's the negative aspect of if your deployment zone is too, like if you don't, in this example, if you don't have the ability to aero from this part of the table effectively, more dense is worse for you because your opponent is getting easier access to pick their fights. So it's not always that more dense equals more better. You have to consider, okay, if this person gets second on this side, how do they defend themselves? And against the extreme case with me against Vanilla Combined, it was pretty impossible. Even if Vanilla Combined is pretty impossible to beat, regardless.
Oh, come on, not with that attitude, certainly.
No, I've been traumatized. All right, we'll stop ragging on the table.
Just get better, Tristan. Come on.
All right, Hugh, tell us about your spicy take.
Yeah, so we've sort of covered it already, but just don't ever move the terrain. Don't play interiors. Just that if there's going to be interesting shapes to have a worthwhile gunfight around in an interior, then it's going to be basically too crowded for models. Now, and also, and this is definitely N4 thinking, I'm yet to crack the seal on N5, but it's also basically any engagement in an interior is rendered trivial by the universality of templates.
Yes.
Now, that, as I understand it, is less prevalent in N5, but that, okay, cool, is your building less than 8 inches, then it doesn't matter what you've got inside. You could have like a piece of total cover that's like hip high or something. But
Yep.
Or if it's more than 8 inches, this is no longer the inside of a building. It's a full like eighth of your play space.
Yep.
That's my hot take.
Yep.
Keep it outside.
And as we mentioned, the solution to this, if you want to play interiors, is to create permanently open-top buildings of infinite height. It actually plays pretty well, even if it sounds counterintuitive. It plays well.
Yep.
Okay, the do's of table building. Pre-game terrain check is a must. I'm not sure about other metas, but in Australia, it's almost religious. When you start looking over a table, you go, are we playing that as an objective room? Is it see into and out of, or is it see through? Is it, are these barricades solid? Are the stairs solid? How are we playing this? How are we playing that?
Do you have any particular go-tos, Luke, on that list?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always try as much as possible and have modified my terrain to try and remove sort of areas where it might be indicate a line of fire when you otherwise don't want there to be a line of fire. So that's something as you're building terrain to consider. But very much, make sure that you've got it clear where there are panel breaks and the like. You should at least have that conversation with your opponent. Good table design hopefully eliminates more of that. Some of the challenges you get, particularly if you're trying to create really interesting, engaging terrain, and we saw that a bit earlier with the fighter jets, is where you've got a piece of terrain that maybe has vertical limitations. Well, you want to make sure that it's clear whether you can see under clearly those particular pieces or exactly where the edge of cover sits so that people can play it readily.
Yep.
So either having a conversation with your opponent's important, but ideally having a guide to the table, I think, makes a big difference.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely best practice to have that laminated sheet alongside, like just in the box, lives with the terrain, goes where it goes. The one thing I have learned to always clarify is if there's terrain that's got sculpted or printed ladders on it, go, okay, is this just visual detail or is this a ladder? Is this ladder S4? Is this ladder S3? Is this ladder S2? And having those conversations before the game. As someone who loves the Rudra, yes, it has climbing plus, but it's, it's important to check, hey, can I move through this space in a way that's sensible, or am I going to deploy this on the other flank?
It's even more important now with climbing plus nerfs.
Yes.
So think about how you want your table to play. Write it down, as we mentioned before. Write down any contentious things. If you want to go the extra mile, build your table solo and experiment on it. Run around with solo markers. Think, if there's a building here that seems too strong, what's the way that the opponent on the other side deals with it? And if you feel like it's not, it's not as effective as it should be, then change things up a little bit. It's a good way. And once you've made that or designed that table, you take pictures of it and you always have that in your back pocket. You can make the table a different way, but you've got that one and you know that there isn't any major problems with it readily available to abuse.
Well, it can be hard to remember how you get your setups as well, and they're not always perfect. We might be able to go through a couple of photos later of how I approached my synthwave table and some of the earlier steps that I took, and it definitely evolves over time. So getting a photo of it so that you can see that for someone who's setting up can be really helpful. If you're not setting up your own table, but then also taking on board feedback from people that play on the table is really important, because you absolutely won't get it right the first time. It will take a few goes.
It's important to get the perspective from different factions as well. Like, Luke, you're like a one faction a year person, and you've played Bakunin the whole time. Bakunin doesn't really have much camo. So you're like, how do my tables play with camo? And so you get people. Feedback is absolutely important, because there are factions in the game you're never going to touch, and that might be a different problem than another faction.
Toha.
Yes. Well, that's actually part of why I've spent the last not a full year, and it won't be a full year, because I actually didn't like them that much. But trying
Trying Toha?
Well, trying to play tables in ways that you wouldn't come across. I was as I was preparing for this episode, I was going through photos of my tables from time immemorial. It's wild how much my orange table has changed from its initial layout. Like,
Because of your experiences with Morats and Toha and that kind of thing?
in part, but also just like forgetting how I'd intended for something to be, trying and doing something. I was like, I don't quite know if this is what it's meant to be, but then that actually works better or has less. When Lil was on Shock Army playing that core linked Sapper Sniper,
Yep.
that definitely tuned. I was playing against her a lot. That tuned my table design pretty profoundly.
Yes, if you're a table maker, you're only going to let a cutter sit on a roof once.
Mm.
Then you're going to go, no. So if it's too hard or it's unclear, it's not fun. We've talked about it a lot. Tables shouldn't be a chore. You should be able to look at a table and pretty easily tell what's what. And if you don't, you've got that little card or you have the pre-game check.
Yeah. Read it. Table read is really important. And you want to make it so that it's a good player will be able to read a table quickly and then understand the attack vectors and how it's going to play. But you shouldn't make it a barrier to the table for a newer player to go, oh, fuck, I don't know what I'm doing here.
Yep. So this is my Warsenal table, and it's a table that can definitely, if you play it a certain way, it will play like shit. If you play it another way, it might play okay. So the first thing that I thought of, because I thought this table would be dense enough, and because I bought a crap load of terrain in terms of money, it didn't translate to as much terrain on the table. So a lot of these buildings don't have blocks in them. They basically are just see-through. If you play them as see-through, the bottom floor of the table is almost like a shooting gallery. So it's incredibly essential with this table specifically that the buildings are see into and out of, but not through. So you can have models in your DZ posted up to protect your DZ when people enter it, but they're not just getting immediately shot from the other side of the table. Same thing with like the objective room style building. You want to decide, like, if this is an objective room, you need to play it as an objective room and it becomes see-through. So you need to plan for that. You need to have it so that you're not seeing straight through the objective room to the other side into someone's DZ, so that it makes it super hard to get into it. Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys have played on this table at all in this particular
Actually,
variation.
haven't had the pleasure.
Neither. Yeah. Although I echo the sentiment that, it should be, I have the rule of it should be see into or out of, but not through.
Yes.
Yeah. It papers over a lot of sins.
Yeah.
In general, it is a pretty good choice. All right.
It looks beautiful, Tristan. I love it.
That, guys, if you want to win best table, you got to make something that is painted well, not that plays particularly well.
And spend a shitload of money on
and
Warsenal.
Spend a shitload of money. So much, too much money.
Yeah, but don't get the ones that are like the alleyway, because that's a diorama, not a terrain piece.
Oh yeah. That's just that's $50 a pop, and it doesn't do anything functional.
Yeah.
All right. Terrain intermediates. How to make a table that separates the apprentice from the journeyman. In my personal humble opinion, the difference between a good table and a great table is to give players opportunity to flex their wargaming brains. For example, finding obscure attack angles, recognizing the path an opponent is going to take to attack you, things of that nature. So you guys will probably be much more versed on this, so I'm going to give it to you because you guys are the table creators.
Thank you.
I think the what we've talked about thus far is like absolutely pivotal for getting a playable Infinity table and the most out of just like, here's a cubic meter of terrain. You need to play a game, or someone needs to play a game on this table in 45 minutes. Make it happen. And I think definitely that good to great is about the designer knowing some of what the players will do.
Yeah.
Slight detour. A mate of mine, I do bouldering as my sort of other hobby. A mate of mine has a bouldering gym in his garage, and occasionally I'll help him set routes on that. And it's all about going, oh, here's a cool move. What if you would like cut loose and jump over to there? That's fucking cool. How do we make that happen? And you put handholds there. You sort of build outwards from your desired state of the cool move. And I think that speaks to play patterns as well, or at least in my own table design practice, where I go, oh, I've laid out the objectives. What happens if there's just one extremely desirable centerline objective spot that's just going to be a motherfucker to take once someone else has gotten it? Motherfucker to dislodge your opponent out of. Or, okay, what if there's an extremely strong ARO spot that covers your centerline objectives, but it's a bastard to move out of? And that one sort of pushes into laying a trap rather than encouraging. But to have, okay, here's an obvious thing that seems cool that will entice players to do X. Now, how do I help their opponent unpick that problem? Whether it's building attack vectors for a zero swick weapon to come and eat a sniper rifle or heavy rocket launcher, or whether it's a way to balance that. Oh no, there are oppressive AROs. What can I do to get around them?
Yep. Nick says, yeah, absolutely. Nick says, if you get stuck on table layouts, give the terrain set to another player and have them set it up with no feedback from you until they're done, which is actually a really interesting way of learning new ways of putting, funnily enough, CB terrain together, because everyone has completely different ideas, and sometimes you get some really weird stuff, and once you combine all that together, you can get really esoteric tables.
Yeah, I definitely echo that sentiment. Jacob Ridley, who I play against from time to time, and he helped me with my synth table and setting it up, and it made a world of difference. Just getting his fresh perspective. He'd seen me set up a few times and played on the way I set it up, and then had a go at it himself, and it was like, oh wow, yeah, you can do that. Like have walls branching off buildings and stuff that I hadn't otherwise tried before.
Yeah.
So it was really good. Good feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with you, Hugh. It's interesting trying to design a table thinking about the game that they're going to play in mind. It seems counterintuitive because it's almost like you're trying to play puppet strings with the players going, if they do this do that, this do that. But it's not just that, because again, every player will see it differently. And you're just giving them opportunities. What they do with that opportunity is up to them.
Yeah, and I think that that's how my first table came together around that question of what if one of the objectives is just like extremely defensible. There was a mission lineup that had, I think all 5 missions needed you to do something on the center lines. What if there's just a clear, not clear best deployment zones, but a clear best objective on the center line that sort of pulls both players in? And that is not something I would have been able to do probably in my first year of playing Infinity, to go, okay, well, what are those first order expectations of, like, how are people going to try and crack this nut open?
Yes.
And plan around that. Because there are, like, yes, there are an infinite number of things most infinite number of things you could do in a turn, but there is a reasonably finite number of, like, likely effective reasonable things that a player is likely to do in that first
Yeah,
turn.
absolutely. You can give the players the opportunity, but it might not be the correct choice for that situation. And it
Yes.
might seem obvious to them, but then they go to do it and they go, oh, I've spent 8 orders to do this thing, and now I'm out of orders and I can't do the other stuff that I wanted to do. So maybe I should have
Yes.
just not done that and done the other things that I want to do.
Yeah.
All right.
Luke, what did you have like a leveling up moment of realizing, like, was your first table your first good table?
My first table has been broken down and reintegrated into other tables. I learned a lot from doing that first table from a hobby perspective, and how to sort of approach the table. But I still use those buildings today, which is a shout out to Miniature Scenery, which is an Australian laser cutting company, and I love their sci-fi buildings because they're a combination of irregular right angles, and very few flat surfaces. They've got a lot of sort of protruding sort of natural cover that work really well for Infinity, and very clear levels, playing to that 3 levels that Tristan mentioned earlier. They do that really well, and have bridges that work and facilitate that as well. Probably to me, an intermediate table and one where we sort of see that leveling up is things where there's a focus around deployment opportunities and ways in which you can create interesting cinematic engagements. So touching on that Hacktow piece earlier in the chat, where there was a sort of a defensible play where James was able to identify an opportunity for a piece, and it created a really interesting sort of challenge for Tristan to play around. I think encouraging those opportunities is really good, but you don't want them to be a dominating negative play experience. So one of the key, I've probably got a couple of traps that I think I've picked up over time. So you can often see some poor tables that use like a valleying effect, where maybe the the higher buildings fringe around the edges of the table, and that can create a negative play experience for people that maybe lack those sort of longer range guns, particularly like hack players and the like, who don't have a great way to engage, or maybe those people who have suffered that really strong alpha. So using building shadows, I think, is really important. Tall buildings can work wonderfully if centrally deployed in a way that means that angles that you can get from deployment zones can be blocked. And I use that quite a lot with my synth table of using secondary levels in the midfield to ensure that snipers on the deployment zone have a limited field of fire. In my hack table, which hopefully we'll put a picture on later, that table is one of those ones that can be really polarizing. And we had it at BCB this year, where I think the first setup was maybe a bit rushed, and created a few feel bad experiences for people. So I reset it up on day 2 and focus on using those building shadows to create interesting spaces where people can engage through the midfield, and have strong interactive experience with the table. The other one I'm cautious of, and you don't see in a lot of my tables, are large singular pieces. I'll tend to err away from them. I think they can work really well with their platforms. And again, the Warsenal hack buildings do a really good job of that because they're so interactive. You can pass through them. They've got lots of ladders and access points. But large singular pieces, like you saw in that frost table earlier, where there's a big hill, it eats up a huge amount of space, and tends to engage or force players to engage on more narrower fronts. And that can mean that a table plays out very consistently, and I don't always like that.
My sort of first couple of terrain kits were Brutal Cities, and particularly with Ryan's earlier work, that's a very prevalent experience for, this is so big that the game can't not be about this piece of terrain,
Yeah.
which, if you have a lot of terrain, you can mitigate, but is an uphill battle.
Yep.
I think platforms can be a great way to leverage that space and have big terrain experiences on the table without stopping people engaging through it or on top of it or whatever the case may be. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't
Yeah,
particularly want a really big piece of terrain to just feel like a null zone.
Yeah,
Like you've just cut a
absolutely.
hole on the table and it may as well not exist there.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a table in the Melbourne Meta that has a large spaceship on it that can be polarizing for some players, and I think I've played on that table a couple of times and I find it quite okay to play on, but yeah, the large pieces become quite dominating and can also focus people on them.
Yeah.
So figuring out ways to play around them.
Yeah, you mentioned bridges a bit earlier as one of your favorite kinds of piece, and I think that
Love them.
bridges are fantastic for turning buildings from islands into pathways.
Yes.
And you have one contiguous upper level rather than just there's just dead islands across the space.
Yeah.
Well, bridges can create really interesting ways to break up engagements and allow people to advance down a corridor that may otherwise be covered by sniper allies, particularly if there are there's edges to those bridges. I don't use edges on my synth table, but instead I play around with that perspective and use the bridges as opportunities to advance over walls that otherwise block troopers. So it becomes an efficient way for models to transgress up the table. So you just be mindful of how you play with those. I think can be really important.
I
but the island that issue is a bit of a problem.
I actually owe you an apology that I'd like to make on the record about that synth table, because I was very unimpressed with it when I first saw it. I was like, he's just done an ombre and it's just squares. And I didn't play it on it at Arc, but I played on it at Border Bash, and it was the favorite of the 5 tables that I played on at Border Bash.
It plays nothing like it looks.
It fucking whips. It's fantastic, and I want that to be on the record that I was wrong about it not being the case.
I can say I think it was the 3rd best voted table at Border Bash, and either 1st or 2nd best voted table at BCB. Something like that. It was definitely high up there.
Well, you made a quip earlier, Tristan, about it being just painted dramatically.
For me, Luke's table paints and plays
works,
well,
but it paid off on the play as well as the paint job.
It did. I played on it at Arc, and even at Arc, I looked at it and went, "This seems a bit naked." I played on it with Luke at Arc, and went, "This is a bit naked." And we played it, and it was absolutely fine because Luke applied that thing of building shadows. When building, it might not look super dense, and we'll see the table later. But it might not look super dense, but the way it's been placed makes it so that the aero pieces on the roofs don't see everything, and there are paths around, even if it doesn't look like it.
But nor are they entirely defanged. Like I felt very well defended on that.
Yes.
When I played on that table. I guess there's also the thread of just paint the fucking thing. Like, put paint on that MDF, put a mat underneath it. Again, going through my albums of terrain photos, there were a couple of events in the last 18 months where there's, I think, been a bit of miscommunication about number of attendees and therefore some last minute. It happens, but just put some paint on the MDF.
Yes.
People online will be like, it soaks up paint. It takes ages. Just put some color on. It doesn't matter. You're not ever going to get and this I think is a materials question. You're not ever going to get a primer full coverage acrylic coat like you do on a metal model or a G-dub plastic. But just put some color on it.
Yeah, even then, MTN 94, if you're in Australia, incredibly vibrant, and
beautiful.
It's only going to take max 2 coats, and even if it soaks up the first one, the second coat's going to go on absolutely fine.
And you're not going to mind putting the second one on because it smells delicious.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like candy. Yeah.
It's upsetting.
Yeah. So
I think you're right. Yeah, it shouldn't getting paint to MDF shouldn't be a barrier. You know, it doesn't take much to hit it with a rattle can. It really doesn't. And you can do so many cool effects with rattle cans. All my terrain's painted with rattle cans
Yeah.
with a small amount of airbrushing. I don't go to the level that Tristan's done on his table. But you can achieve really cool effects just straight out of the can.
Yeah.
And even playing with graffiti caps like slow flow caps that cost you like 50 cents.
Mm.
Yeah.
You know, chuck them on the MTN cans and you can do amazing blends.
Yep.
Really
Well,
easily.
and even without doing anything technical, like my orange table that has been voted best table twice, like that, there's no technique there. It's literally just before building, hose everything down in one of three colors, and then assemble it such that you've got like it's basically a very simplified version of the Brutal Cities Infinity Labs studio scheme, and it looks so much better than it did before it was painted.
100%. Any
The
paint
only
is better than
challenge
no paint.
The only challenge I find with this, as a person who has quite a lot of flat pack MDF ready to go, is I do paint in sub assemblies. So for me, that is a way to get contrast and color differentiation on my terrain.
Yep.
Without sort of chucking the whole thing together and getting it to the table and then coming back and trying to fill it in.
No, paint before. Like if you can plan it out, paint before assembly is my advice for the lazy MDF builder.
The lazy, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Hugh.
Yeah.
You have a system.
Yeah. So this is this. I touched on this before about like blocks. So this is sort of a 16 block table where so you've got this little this alleyway of warning signs that essentially structures those two blocks. I don't have a whole lot to say about this, but it's just interesting to be like, okay, what's in this 16th of the table? Is this how does it interact with the adjacent 16ths of the table? Is it overlooking them? Is it cowering from them? And I guess so this table is built around there's a two-tiered tower, like CB card tower, in the far deployment zone. That's the first thing that went onto the table.
Yep.
And then the three centerline objectives, which are all you need to cross the center line to get to any of them, or you need to like really properly leave your deployment zone to get from that far DZ onto the objectives, and that the near DZ has that zigzagging alleyway to bring a shotgun or a rifle or a Spitfire up under the sniper rifle or heavy rocket launcher there.
Yeah, I really think the first thing you'll notice with this table is there are long fire lanes. If you look at the bottom right, that building is covered from the two-tier building from the other DZ, and it covers a third of the table virtually.
Yep.
But there is the path through the other buildings on the other side having little blockades to block the line of sight. There is a path to get within, combi rifle ranges virtually.
There is. And it also, yes, it covers the close objective to it. So this was laid out for a tournament that, again, was very center line centric. It doesn't see the middle objective and it doesn't see its opposite objective. It can put a pretty oppressive watch on that close objective, but it defends its own DZ quite well from that building in the bottom right. But it actually has fuck all to do with the rest of the table.
Yes.
And quite deliberately by design. And that's a very... Well, again, that's a bit of a bait and switch on my part, in that it looks really useful and turns out to have perhaps, if you end up putting your 5-person Morat core on that building, you're going to be probably pretty upset about that choice.
That's a very excellent point, and it kind of illustrates what we were talking about before. It at first glance seems like a really excellent spot. As soon as your opponent starts their first turn, you'll realize that your Suryat doesn't see shit, and your opponent does not have to interact with it at all. Sure, you're covering one objective really well, but you're not covering the other two well at all.
Yeah. And that's what stands. I have played on this table, and it plays really, really well. You've got a lot of sort of horizontal and vertical cover. You've got that avoidance of that valleying issue that I mentioned earlier. We've got multiple levels that are sort of waving through the table, which means that you don't get any one oppressive position. Those two boxes on the sort of center line are blocked off on the top, so that there's no tag presence that can really deploy and close an opponent out. And you've got 4 layers, which is unusual. I tend to stick to the Tristan comment of 3, but here it works really well.
Yeah, well, it's just that one building.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, sort of, I guess, intended to be the prize for having dealt with Fort Fuck Off in the other side. In that, if you as the player on the near deployment zone can get an Overwatch thing up there, then your opponent has some real problems. It's not gonna be like any Swick weapon up there you'll be able to get in under it, but that it's to have, a Hollow Man Spitfire up there seems all right,
but not oppressive.
Not oppressive.
We can like systematically point out just all of the things we're talking about for the, what makes a good table. So you've got plenty of, like, this table is not lacking for terrain at all. There is plenty of stuff in the DZ, both of them. You've got things that cut the DZ line of sights up. You have, in this case, 4 layers, but that 4th layer is only a single building, which is fine. So you have 3 readily available layers, and these layers are easily accessible for any model. Having Super Jump and Climbing Plus still gives you that advantage, but there are plenty of methods you can use to get to this second floor. There's probably 3 staircases, one at the back, and then there's little
there's
vaulty.
Not one at the back. There's explicitly not one at the back, because that side doesn't have good access to the actual objectives, and that's the downside for taking Fort Fuck Off.
Well, there you go.
But yeah, if you ever get a chance, if Viv ever resumes selling or licenses the Risers from Knights of Dice, pick up a box or 2. They are impeccable, and they pack down into basically the size of the largest single box.
Even then, guys, you're looking at, like, the first look at this table, it doesn't look like a CB card table, but it is 3 or 4 sets of CB card on the table, and these risers, even if Knights of Dice aren't selling them anymore, they are available from other places, or you can make something very similar yourself pretty easily, and they just elevate the table experience, like, from the average CB terrain to a 10. Like, anyone would be happy to have this table round 5 at a tournament.
I'll throw a plug out there for one of my favourite laser cutters in Australia, Scorched Earth Designs. He does some really cool sci-fi like risers. That only issue is they're not quite as varied in shape as what you're getting here. But they've got a lot of detail on them, and they're really, really nice. So I've got a couple of them in flat pack. I haven't put them together yet. But yeah, there's definitely options there, and scratch building is also an option.
Absolutely.
Risers are really good.
Alrighty. What's some other intermediate strategies? Incorporating interesting mechanics that can give you an advantage if used correctly. For example, sat zone bushes, terrain bonuses, strong aero spots that don't provide cover. Have fun, but don't go crazy with it.
Yeah, so I guess there's two threads about that. Don't go crazy with it. One, we're all here to play Infinity. Please don't write too much new rules text.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, there's a time, like, people are coming to an Infinity tournament to play Infinity, not to play test. I'm sure it's fantastic, but your offshoot mod of Infinity, it's not what people are there to do. And similarly, well, no, not similarly. Also, the other thread of not going crazy with it is, particularly in the case where a strong alpha has really put you on your heels, if the table itself applies friction to both players, that is an advantage for the player who is able to deliver the first punch, because at that point the person who's playing from behind finds themselves not only playing against their opponent, but also against the table, and that really is going to feel pretty fucking shitty.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
But the benefits of such mechanics are that your table will have unique feelings. It will have things that aren't the first thing that, so you're not thinking of it as first comes to your head. Especially in N5, things like sat zones are only benefits are only benefits for the defender now, because the +1 special dice is not removed. You're still burst 2 through a sat zone effectively. So it's only a weakness for the attacker. But people don't really think like that currently. Terrain bonuses are virtually unused in tables in Australia, at least. Hugh has his jungle table, and Peter has his aqua table, his waterport table. But apart from that, I haven't used terrain bonuses at all on a table ever.
Well, and that jungle table is a tale of taking on negative feedback, being really
Polarizing.
important. Well, it absolutely, and the core, like when I built that table, I spent 6 months planning, building, painting, futzing around with. The thing that I had as a core truth in my heart as I undertook that task was that the terrain rules were not punishing enough. So I'd committed the sin of writing additional rules text as well. But I tried, so I played a game in my backyard with that, and it was pretty fucking tough. So I didn't run. I was like, oh, that's in beta. We won't run that for the tournament. And I played on it at the tournament, and man, the terrain rules are punishing enough to have a third of the table that you're going to be moving through occupied by terrain zones, even if you have some models who benefit from them, is really hard work. It turns out losing 25% of your movement, 30%, whatever it is, of your movement is really tough, and especially if you're playing from behind.
Yes.
Yeah. And the challenge is, I think, as Nick's pointing out in the chat, that movement skills can be really irregularly distributed. So you can get sort of weird interactions, not just with the rules, but also with certain armies that all of a sudden just go, wow, we're away.
Yep. Which is why I think not applying it to the whole table is a good thing. It's a reason why I think potentially Peter's use of it is really interesting, because the water level is only the bottom floor, and it's probably only 25% of the table, maybe less, that gets that benefit. And it's almost like it's the floor below the ground floor. The base floor isn't actually the base floor.
It's an easily avoidable play experience if it's not really that relevant. And I've played on that table a number of times now, and I'm very rarely do I hit into that sort of water terrain because it plays so well without it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always stayed out of it. I've always stayed out of it for lack of any terrain aquatic. But I think, it's like, if I know that table's coming to the tournament, do I include terrain aquatic in my list? no, that's not quite. It's not quite there, but I think I don't know. Maybe hot take. I don't know. I don't read enough of the blogs. There should just be terrain total.
A lot more.
No. Sorry.
There should only be one terrain skill, is what you're saying.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense because terrain skills are already underutilized itself, and splitting that up into 4 or 5 different types of terrain just obscures it to the point of negligence. Like there is virtually no point unless you have terrain total to have a terrain skill.
Yeah, there's the idea of the play fantasy of Infinity is that these are capable operators, chosen for their own specific expertise, but presumably, I don't know, did you bring a parka? Like, is it cold out? Be prepared.
Yep.
Is it going to be sandy? Have a think about how you're going to run through that sand.
Yep. We talked about it before with Hugh's table. Tables should have multiple ways to interact with the higher levels for models that don't get movement skills. A table should never have a requirement for movement skills. So reaching certain points of the table shouldn't be an exercise in spending 3 jump orders or 3 climb orders. It should be like Infinity is already a relatively order intensive thing to move one model from one part of the table to another part of the table. It shouldn't lock you out of the table.
And they should be obvious as well. I think that's one thing I picked up from the Canberra meta is making, terrain really obvious to a player and the way in which they interact with it. So you'll see in my scent table that all the yellow ladders are in a really stark yellow. They really stand out on the table, and that just means that a player can really readily consider where the access points are. I use it in some of my other tables. I'll use like vending machines that are just slightly less than S2 as great vaulting opportunities to move between levels. And again, having them in a different color so that they stand apart from the building so that the player's eyes are drawn to them and can see that that's an access point without it sort of interfering with the table layout or otherwise, looking sort of funky.
Yeah. For fear of dating myself, the video game Mirror's Edge was new and topical when I was forming core opinions about how game design should work.
Mirror's Edge is a great example.
It's really, really good visual design. Similarly, my orange table, if it's bright blue, in total contrast to everything else, it's entirely vaultable. Yeah. Well, I must assume we'll get to it.
We will be getting to it.
Yeah, so that clear indications. You want someone to be like, "Oh, I'm so clever. I remembered I have super jump, so I can unpick this problem," rather than, "Oh boy, this obvious answer is super jump, but I didn't bring that. I guess I concede."
Yeah. Yep. So what we have here, I believe, is Luke's table.
Yep.
This is once again, you look at each individual piece of terrain and it's not an amazing amount of detail aside from potentially the rooftops, which look like they've gotten a little brush with an airbrush in each little spot. But if you replace this with raw MDF, it wouldn't have the feel to it. And this really, I think this is the table that, it might be a different layout, but this is a table that reminds me of why Luke loves bridges so much. I've definitely played on this table against Luke, and his Morats have bridged around the side of the table and absolutely destroyed me.
This is actually one of these miniature scenery buildings, one of my earliest cuts of painting terrain and formed part of one of my first tables. I haven't finished this table. It's the barricade you can see a raw resin.
When was this photo taken, Luke?
It's a recent one. Yeah, I still haven't finished them. Yeah, this is a bit of a current work in progress, but I am going to take the cars and the barricades out for another table that I'm halfway through. Watch this space. But yeah, the idea behind this table is really to play with those sort of multiple levels that you get from the miniature scenery buildings, create really clear access points. It plays fairly congested in the sense of there's a lot of scatter on there. It's probably fairly high up. But you can see where I've used things like the dumpsters to create access points up to second levels.
Yep.
That are different colours. The vending machines, likewise. The bridges, which remove that sort of islanding type approach that you can get from buildings. And then I've done an interesting thing with this table, which is I don't think we've touched on yet. Is the pivot to a 45-degree angle for the buildings, which for this particular table plays a lot better. It means that you can create ways to advance up the table. 45-degree building layouts tend to create risks of sort of the effilade or flanking fire. But because it is a little bit heavier on the scatter terrain, you can break those lines of fire up. There's still lots of long lanes. There's still lots of ways in which snipers can interact with the table, but it never feels bad playing on it. Certainly from my experience, I've played 20 plus games on this table, and never really had an opportunity where I've been closed out of a game or felt that I couldn't sort of penetrate into that middle section.
Yep. Excellent. We'll get to miniature scenery in a bit as well. All right. Consider a table guide. We've talked about this. Unfortunately, we're jumping our guns on this. Consider a table guide that covers contestable points and provides clear rulings for players to follow. For example, doors, hatches, define what can and can't be vaulted, bushes, if things are solid to the bottom, things are a bit of a regular shape, reduces the ambiguity and bad experiences when players thought they could do something that wasn't intended by the table maker. So again, it is really important that everyone either read the card or if there isn't a card to talk about certain things. There has been situations where people have gone, I can see through the bottom of this, because some metas play true line of sight by default, and some of them play, we're playing this as a block, not it's not geometrically what it is. It just fills it's a cookie cutter shape of that. And a little bit more intermediate tableside differentiation, so things to look for defensive points for links and especially lieutenants. Certain factions in the game get really poor lieutenant options, and having a spot to definitively place a weaker LT is important. Sightlines over key objectives. You'll notice this on Hugh's tables that there is very deliberate choices about what buildings can see what objectives and what sides of tables can reliably access those objectives. So as she was saying before with the previous table, one side didn't have as easy access up to that riser than the other side, which would make it more difficult to get to those objectives, considering all three objectives were on risers.
Yes. I guess in your play, consider denying your opponent which the parts of the table that might be more useful to them, as well as what you're going to do with your stuff. If there's no good spot to put that Morat Core Dakini Sniper on this side of the table, great, let them have it.
Yep. And here we have go on, Luke.
I'd add one extra thing, sorry, Tristan, and that is you also can look at ways in which you can deploy things like infiltrators, impersonators, turrets, crazy creatures. But they all play into the way in which certain missions play out. And so having locations that support that, particularly missions, if you see unmasking or any sort of HVT orientated missions in the mission lineup, having table sides that provide more defensive HVT deployment can be really advantageous and can reward a player who can really eyeball the table and weigh up whether going early in the game, going first is going to benefit them or going second because they can get the pick of a really defensible position.
Yep. Excellent. So here we have Hugh's groundbreaking best table twice in a row, but not really, but kind of. I think this is the most common layout.
Yes. Yeah, and in a quite recent iteration.
Yes. So as things we've said before, the stark blue things are, vaultable things. They're very obviously meant to aid the movement of the table, and it's very easily to recognize. You look at the table, they look like they should be vaulted. Hugh, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your philosophy for this table?
Yeah, so the thing that I was interested in was changing your vertical level as a tactical option that was pretty well constantly going to be available. And hence, there's a lot of ladders, there's a lot of vaultables. And I think I mentioned this before, that leftmost two-story building, all of whichever scenario, whether it's there's 3 objectives on the center line, whether there's 2, that building is always going to have an objective on it, and therefore, and both deployment zones have pretty uncontested access to that rooftop, inviting players to go up and claim that space. However, because the buildings themselves are quite tall, there's also pretty effective shadows to hide behind as you go in. So into the center, you're almost under the lip of that building.
Yep.
And on the far lane, you end up being just completely obscured from that place. So moving out of your DZ might be a bit hairy, but once you're out, you're sort of off to the races, or there's those resources aren't looking at you.
Yep.
The other thing is that almost all of the upper levels are connected by a network of bridges. Now they're not. It's not a web. It's definitely the one snaking path, and then this island in the near deployment zone. But that sort of having that all be contiguous and available to be moved along safely is pretty important. And the rooftops, I think of them a little bit as I think of them a little bit like the jungle in a MOBA, where you've got your 3 straightforward lanes where you do the obvious thing, and that's on ground level, and then on the rooftops you've got space that rewards asymmetric play or mobility skills or doing something that's a little bit off kilter a bit more.
Yes. I really love this table because it gives so much differentiation between different parts of it. The far left has your low vis sat zone bushes. You can, from memory, you can walk through the bushes. So they don't block line. They're not line of sight blocking. They're not movement blocking, but they are low vis a nuisance. So it's almost like you have an ARO piece on this building, almost to the point where an impetuous model might want to risk just moving forward and smoke dodging against that because you're at a little bit less of a reliable shot in that regard.
Yes.
You kind of go to the center part of the table and it seems a lot more dense. It's inviting that close combat CC shotgun engagements, which is really nice. And then you start moving into the right hand of the table, which is a bit more open. It's a bit more, I want to shoot you with the HMGs and the sniper rifles, and I want to move up. Like, I want to open up the table and move up the bridges. And it does have that MOBA-y feel. I was going to say more a Counter-Strike map feel for me, where it has those 3 lanes, but it has the potential to kind of swerve in and out. So you've got, like, if you can get across this bridge, so if you prone a bunch on the far right, you can get behind this big building and maybe you can get down that ladder and kind of find a safe way into their DZ if you spend the orders.
Absolutely.
It just reeks of opportunities, and that's only, at first glance. You can play this table a bunch, and there's so many things you can do, and with so many different armies as well.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I've sort of come to realize about it is that it rewards in particular the Zeta and the Sphinx quite profoundly in that the bridges between those upper level buildings are all about 52 millimeters across, and longer than 8 inches.
Yep.
So I think maybe with Super Jump in N5, I'm not sure, you might be able to clear them, but you're not ever going to be able to get a tag across them. So if you want a tag to run around, it has to do so on ground level.
Yep.
And I like the idea that different weight classes of trooper have access to different parts of the table, or
Yes.
have different strengths or different multipliers in different zones.
Yeah, it's almost as if your first reaction is I'm going to throw my tag and try and get it on the top of this building. There is a method there where I'm going to be able to get into CC with that tag. I can come from the left, or I can come from the front, or I can come up these scaffolds. There are ways in which that is a bad decision. It seems like a good decision because it's like, ooh, put big tag on top of big building. But there are ways of dealing with it, and it might come out to bite you in the butt.
Yep.
Beautiful table. Love it.
Yeah. Yes.
Very pleased with it.
Very love it. All right. This is a little thing of my own. So, layouts matter. We're going to have a couple pictures of a very infamous table in the Australian meta. This is the usual layout. It is a compound in a diamond shape, and your DZ kind of slightly cuts into the diamond shape. So the first thing you're going to notice is that there are these barbed fences. Now, along these fences, you'll find little gaps in which an S2 is allowed to climb through. So either, if you want to get into this compound, you have to go through these little holes, or you have to go through the main gates. So right off the bat, there is a limit and a restriction on how you get into the center of the table. Once you do get into this compound, it gets extremely dense, which really benefits the MIM6 SMGs. It really benefits the close quarters troops. But you do, as Luke loves and Hugh loves, you do have some of the bridges, you do have ways to move around, but it becomes almost like an alleyway fight. I'm guessing you guys have played on this table a couple of times before.
I love it. I'm just wondering, what mission is it set up for? What are those objectives?
Supply raid would be my guess.
Yeah. Yes, that checks out.
It's a beautiful table visually. I love what Kev's done with it in terms of the color palette and the way in which it makes the levels really obvious. It doesn't use a lot of irregular shape things, probably just those boulder mounds are the only areas. Most of it's really readily apparent how to play it. There are some challenges with those knights of dice buildings in that they're quite narrow. They probably don't allow for a lot of larger bases to move through it, which amplifies that density. And it very much favors shotguns and SMGs and really short range weapons, which I think is where I've had mixed results on it. It can really depend on the faction you're playing.
So I think there's another layout of it where those fences.
We are about to. We are definitely. So we'll get to it now. So this is the layout that Kev has tried a couple of times. That is a bit open and a bit different. So instead of sticking to your diamond compound, you essentially cut the table through the middle and spread out the buildings more traditionally. So it's the same table. It plays completely different. If you open these gates and have someone on top of here, you have straight lines. The A rows are much more apparent. The movement through the table on the second floor, as Luke mentioned before, there is a way to use this bridge to just avoid the gate. The point being is that you can mix and match your tables, you can change them completely, and you can make it virtually a new table.
I haven't played on it in this iteration, but it looks from a play experience, it looks a lot better.
Yeah, it is. So the downside of the previous table, Tristan, if you want to click back to it, is that my experience is that deploying outside the compound is usually a mistake, which means that you end up playing a 3x3 table with the rest of a 4x4 sort of laying on the cutting room floor, and that your deployment zone is just that wedge of the corner, which, as Tristan, we've talked a lot about that horizontal or enfilading fire across, and this is where your what's the word? It's not skeuomorphic. Your representative thing of, oh well, it's the security fence of a compound. Obviously, none of the buildings butt up against it.
Yep.
Comes back to bite you, because having a Drago coming around the corner rolling 5 dice at whatever you've got means that whatever you've got there is not going to be receiving those 5 dice for too many orders in a row.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas the other one, just it sings. And it's actually a table where, because the theme is so obvious and clear and dramatic, it's a table where I would strongly consider including rules text along the lines of the old armory doors, where there's
Yes.
some way to interact with the gate,
Yes.
even though that's not a core mechanic.
So
even if it's just one order to open, one order to close.
I can tell you that when Kev made this, he did play it in that you can open and close the doors with a short skill, which was really interesting, because you go open the doors, I shoot out, I close them, and then I do what I want to do. The one thing I really like about the second table versus the first is the first table looks like an entire battlefield. This second table looks like it is a piece of a compound that continues to go on from other parts. It makes it feel like, I feel like this table is more thematic than the other table, even though the other table seems like it is. Probably seems more thematic at first glance, but this table just gives me the vibes of there's like the compound is much bigger and we're just a small part of this doing our thing.
Yeah,
That's cinematic aspect.
Yep.
Yeah, I describe the order system to people who aren't familiar with Infinity as the game zooms in on the parts of the game that matter.
Yep.
And this feels like, your high command has not just, in Napoleonic style, agreed on a battlefield, said, well, the bounds of this. It's rather, there's a kill team in here that are going to murk someone, and it's this exact slice of things because that's where it needs to happen.
Yes.
And that's cool as hell.
So, a message to Kev when he listens to this: use this more often. All right. Terrain pros: how to make a table look as good as it plays. Again, for me personally, there is no magical secret to making an incredible, smart, nuanced table that isn't solvable and provides endless opportunities, because I don't think they exist. Honestly, the difference between an intermediate and a pro table is one plays really nice, the other gives you that sense of uniqueness and beauty that only comes with hours and hours of dedicated effort and thought. I think making a good table in Infinity isn't the hardest thing in the world. I think you can ruin it if you try and overthink it too much. The thing that really makes you walk away from a table and go, holy shit, I want to play on that again, is the table didn't fuck up the game. You felt like the table gave you opportunities, and it was fucking beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what kind of stands out to me.
I have a comment on beauty that we'll come back to, but it's not about making a table. Actually, I'll do it now. It's part of the point of a table is to be the frame rather than the picture, and so this is a thing that I think is really aptly done on that compound table, where, and actually I think most of the tables that we've looked at today, but that's basically any trooper is going to stand out from that environment.
Yes.
So I was thinking, sorry, Luke, those miniature scenery buildings that were part of your first table, those fantastic. That like there's color, there's variety, but it's very desaturated. It creates room for the miniatures to sing visually as well as mechanically, and that's really fucking cool.
I think color palette plays a huge, I suppose, impact on the way in which players interact with the scenery. So it's great to go vibrant color, but you want it ideally on more vertical surfaces. So trying to keep neutral colors to A, the majority of the table, and then B, particularly for those flat surfaces that are on top. You'll see it with the synth table pictures that I've got really vibrant colors on vertical surfaces to make the table interesting, but try to really keep very neutral, dark tones that match with the mat, so that people can see what they're playing on, how they're interacting with it. And yeah, absolutely. You want this environment that you're creating for people to be a platform for them to really enjoy the game, and play the game well, and not take away from the joy of making, or take away from people's individual models, paint jobs or anything like that. That's where really noisy tables can be problematic. I love the micro arts printed tables, but gee, they're really busy. And disappear into them.
Yep. I definitely feel that, especially if your paint scheme is relatively in the grey scale of things for its primary colour. Your model is going to blend into a table like that.
Yeah.
And just a little thing, custom-made tables let you create unique pieces that don't exist anywhere else. If you really want a table that feels unique, you can do the beautiful thing of making your own terrain pieces. And you can make them whatever shape you want. So 3D printing resin, like Luke has with the barricades and stuff like that. When you buy terrain, you're going to buy it in an efficient kind of form, which is MDF squares. Maybe there is, some L-shaped things, or maybe there's that, but it's going to stick to very basic shapes. So what we're going to get to now is Hugh's custom-made table, where I would say 75% of the table is pretty much custom. You are never... I know Hugh might be a bit down on his own table. I don't think it's as bad as you think. The cliffs are completely unique and offer, you are never going to have a table experience like this one unless you play on this table.
It's true.
It's fun to play on. I've played on it a couple of times. It plays really well. Yeah.
Tables evolve. Just because it's not at the point in which you want it doesn't mean it's not going to keep evolving.
Well, no, and this absolutely has evolved quite a lot, and in response to much to my chagrin, negative feedback about it, or not, hey, Hugh, your table sucks, go die in a hole, but rather, hey, so that there used to be, you see the satellite dish up at the very top of the table. Behind that, in the first iteration of this table, there was a bridge connecting those two spaces.
Yep.
That meant that a Chimera and her Pupniks, with their terrain total, could just piss bolt across the table and kill whatever arrow piece is taking cover.
Yep.
And then you move anything with a sniper rifle up there, and it's got fantastic shots into whichever DZ it hasn't come from. Similarly, the first draft, so you'll see there's two sort of kinds of foliage bit. The little ones on the hillside were what they all were initially, and then it went on its first outing, and players who weren't me playing my friend and us both setting out to have a collegial time, but rather players who were setting out to win, and not players being competitive rather than gracious first and foremost, which is a valid way to be.
Absolutely.
Were finding that the boundaries of the terrain zones were really murky, both horizontally and vertically. So I've refined that a fair bit and expanded the bases to match the outer extent, and then filled them up with garishly coloured aquarium plants.
Yeah, I was going to say, did the Nangs help with the color palette?
So I've
For anyone who doesn't know what that is, they
call them whippets in the States.
potentially. I think
They do.
they're little cans of gas for sour cream that you can.
So nitrous oxide is a wonderful thing for whipping cream if you're into making sort of structural cakes. So Ryan of Brutal Cities had, through COVID, I think he was seeing a lot of Nangs on his walks around his neighborhood, and like, well, how do we recycle these into something that's not just urban blight? And so he designed a couple of terrain pieces that would provide a home for the humble discarded Nang. And so I bought, I think, like a dozen of them, and they sat on a shelf unused because I wasn't going out. I wasn't leaving the house much during COVID. And so they moved house with me across the city. And there was a morning I'm going out to breakfast with my partner, and hang on, what's that in the little parklet on our street? The playground is carpeted with Nangs. And I got really excited and then really worried that someone might have cleaned them up by the time I got back. And Caitlin was like, "No, Hugh, you're not coming to brunch with pockets jangling full of fucking Nangs."
Dirty used Nangs.
And she managed to talk me down about the and she was right. There was less civic pride in our neighborhood than I was worried about. So
They were there when you got back.
they were there when we got back.
But for a serious note, I love the way this table really pushes the boundaries of what you can achieve in Infinity. You know, Hugh's leveraging terrain zones, sat zones, playing around with the way in which you interact with the table, making it a really, really cinematic experience for the people that are playing on it.
Yep.
I had a great time playing on it the couple of times I've played on it. Hugh, you're a lot braver man than me for using the irregular shapes. That's probably my only complaint with the table is, foliage does my fucking head in. As a person who looks at the table, I go, fuck, I can't.
They're infinitely tall now. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, perfect. So that's probably my only criticism of the table. But then, I think by and large, you can probably, I would wear that in a sense of as a play experience. It's really well thought out and plays beautifully.
Yeah, well, I think there's a degree of like, I went into it going, oh, cool, I've got this rad idea. I've got this opinion about a rules module of the game not being as high friction as it ought to be. And that I was going to like blow them all away with this radical departure. And it turns out that I was wrong about... So basically, I really like the table, but I didn't like the humble pie that I had to eat to get there.
Yeah.
In that I was wrong about the rules mechanic. It turns out there's not actually enough space on a 4x4 to really have deep jungle, and the rules of Infinity don't really represent it very well. And the river looks less beautiful than I had hoped it would.
It looks fine.
It looks fine, but like, I don't know. It was meant to look like water, and it doesn't quite. Bah. But yeah, I'm really pleased with how it has evolved and what I've the humble pie that I've learned to swallow.
No, it's. I don't know if this has won best table yet, but
No,
again,
not yet.
it's been up there. It is majority of the time the prettiest table at the event. It
Definitely gets a lot of questions from passers-by, which is nice.
Yes, it gets you interested in the game. This looks like I'm playing XCOM 2, which is kind of what I want my Infinity game to be. And even the idea of having an objective room on the second story is great to me because, again, it invites that really close combat style stuff, whereas the hillsides behind it invite that long range sniper HMG engagement. So everything in my list is getting value, which is what I really like as well, so long as I am clever enough to use it that way. Common theme between Hugh's tables, guys, is they're all good. Before we go on, Hoppy has a question, a rather valid question that has a really boring answer. How do you transport this amount of terrain? I find most terrain pieces to be quite hard to transport because it doesn't stack very well, nor does it nest very well. In short, it takes up a lot of space. Yes. My table you saw before that was well painted, that takes up 4 boxes. It takes up about half of the back seat and the boot of my car. So if I want to take 3 tables with me, it is the entirety of the back seat and the entirety of the boot. So unfortunately, Infinity Terrain just takes a shitload of space.
I have a rule when I'm doing a table that it has to fit in one of the Bunnings 65-litre containers, and that has played out okay so far for me. I think it depends very much on the producer. The synth table we'll show some photos of later by my boy Ryan from Brutal Cities, who you'll see a lot of his terrain come through here. He does fucking awesome terrain. I love it. And that nests really well. So I can get that down. I think I don't know what size it is. It's like a 30-litre container.
It
maybe
all
40 litres.
nests inside itself, which is excellent.
It works really well. So scatter's really key, I think, to being able to transport a table as well. Because if you've got a lot of big buildings, you don't need massive buildings to make a table. What you need is a variety of buildings, ideally that can stack together, and then more scatter will help with that, and you can fill gaps in a box.
Yeah. So I don't drive, and none of my tables are quite so condensed as to fit onto the back of my push bike. So as a lifelong passenger princess, my rule for tables and my priority in buying terrain is that it needs to fit into it must be some like standard shipping size, but like a who gives a crap big box of toilet paper. A table needs to fit into one of those, and the blue riser table actually fits into about half of one of those,
like a small laundry
like
hamper.
a laundry hamper.
Yeah,
it's fantastic, and that's almost entirely because of Viv's brilliant work making that pack down so nicely. But so that's been a priority, and correct, Luke. It is fitting scatter inside of buildings. This jungle table breaks the rule in that the foliage doesn't pack down nicely, so it goes in a separate box, and the hillsides are just an absolute bitch move.
Yes.
Like they're just so.
Yeah, foam's hard.
Yeah, well, and I went for the cheap spackle to cover them with, and boy, it sure is landlord quality.
In short, it's going to be really difficult to get a table that you can comfortably carry on the train with you.
Oh no.
Risers and CB terrain are going to be the best way to go because it all stacks together, and you'll probably get it in the size of a small box. But realistically, if you go for a table like mine or a table with really irregular shapes, it's going to be, and I religiously wrap everything in bubble wrap, it's going to be in a decently sized box or multiple decently sized boxes, in my case anyway.
Yeah, that's a challenge with MDF. If you have a lot, particularly that Warsenal table, has the risk of delaminating if it's not wrapped in bubble wrap and things. I mean, you can rattle can it, and that helps sort of with resistance to abrasion. But yeah, if it's butting up and bouncing against a box edge, it'll break up over time.
And you can't really get too attached to it. The table's going to get damaged over time no matter what.
Yeah.
You kind of have to go with the flow.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
after a year and a half, you look at it and you touch it up and you make the real battle damage into fake looking battle damage, and the table gains new life.
Yeah, that's definitely another thing. I'll particularly before BCB, I'll like the weekend before, I'll like unpack and assemble the table or the tables that I'm bringing, and make a plan to patch like any glaring issues that week, rather than have a damaged table out on parade, so to speak.
Yeah. So this is a table that I think I saw a long time ago, like a year ago, that really stood out to me. It was somewhere in Europe. I don't know what particular tournament it is.
I think it's in France.
Potentially. I don't know how it plays, but it just screamed out to me that I want to play on this table. It looks amazing. It has the muted colors that you want. If you play the trees as solid all the way around and you just treat them as solid pieces of terrain, and the rocks themselves seem to have enough vaultable points, it seems like this table would play really well, and I just love the look of it. I just wanted to, whoever made this, great job. And this is probably an example of the trees aren't probably custom made, but everything else is probably custom made. It wouldn't have cost the same as buying a full set of MDF, because infinity tables are actually quite expensive if you want to buy them. So this is probably a really great way that the table designer made his own table, made it play how he wanted it to play, and at the same time created something unique that I haven't seen through Infinity Global since.
It's so fucking cool.
It's super cool. And it's just snowy rocks and snowy trees. But it's in Infinity, you just see a shitload of MDF. You don't see this. So this is really cool.
Yeah, and this is part of my push towards the Jungle table, because I remember seeing this going, that makes the brain go.
All right, just want to say that. All right, cool. Tables should provide a narrative space for the player's models to tell a memorable story. They can be interesting and thematic, but shouldn't distract from the models. We've kind of gone over that as well. Color palette can play a part here. Making the ground and roofs a more neutral color makes the models stand out at a glance. We just love getting ahead of ourselves. This is a big one that Hugh loves to do as well. Matching objectives are like painting your bases. It blends it all together. We love in Affinity Australia to use our 100 or so orange acrylic objectives for people who don't have them. But they're great because they stand out. But at the same time, when Hugh puts his own objectives down, it feels like it belongs on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, the orange ones are like, they feel a little bit like, you've forgotten to bring your bathers to high school swimming again. Well, I guess you're using the school pair.
Yes.
Yeah.
And especially when you're playing supply raid and you got to put 9 of them down.
The only challenge to that, I would say, is for newer players, probably focus on getting your table up to speed.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Because to me, objectives, worst case, if you've got a crate on a 40 mil base, that's going to get you covered.
Oh yeah.
And get you moving. But yeah, a beautiful set of objectives, and they don't have to cost the world.
No.
It's probably one area where scratch building stuff can be really effective.
Absolutely. This is Kevin's, I want to say Necromunda table is what he calls it.
Yeah.
This is one of those tables where I'm not sure about your guys' experience, but this also has that real thematic theme for me where everything's painted. It's not painted particularly well, but it just screams narrative to me.
Yep.
I don't know how many times you guys have played on this. I know some people had some complaints about line of sight and stuff. There was so much terrain he had that it was difficult to put it together.
Yeah.
But
This is I've played on this table. It plays really well. To me, it probably favours units that can super jump a little bit, and that maybe an N5 might be an interesting piece because there's a lot of elevation. There's also one of the issues you get with terrain that's designed for Necromunda is it's probably not as designed with the cover aspect of Infinity in mind. So you see a lot of barricades and the like that are relatively open. So you have to kind of agree with your opponent what is and isn't open when you're playing it. But if you've got, I haven't had any issues playing on it. I think earlier builds of it probably focused it a little bit too shotgun alley type approach. This particular layout I've played on from the right, deploying on the right hand side. There were some long lanes that made it hard to penetrate into probably the right hand third of the table if you were attacking into it. But it didn't stop you from interacting with the objectives on the center line.
Yeah, I think this is just a good example of the terrain. Like, you don't have to paint your terrain well. If it's all painted and it sits on the table, it looks like it fits and it elevates the experience to some degree.
Yeah, it's cool.
All right, we're going to move on to what everyone's been dying for. Tables are meant to evolve over time. So this is Luke's Synthwave table, and this is its first outing with myself versus Luke at Arkfinity.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, the very first 2 orders I spent, I peeked Sheshkin through a door, and you shot at it with a right gun missile launcher. And both Sheshkin...
That sounds like something I'd do.
And both Sheshkin and a Caliban in camo exploded in a single order.
Yeah.
But...
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the first iteration.
So when I set out to design this table, I wanted something that was really going to pop and add a bit of color, and that you can see that in the walls, but ignores that sort of top-down look where it plays out fairly bland so that it doesn't interact with the player's view of the table too dramatically. You'll see I've made a couple of choices here to use the longer Brittle Cities walls to break up and create interesting interactions for players to advance up the table. It does feel very open up top, and that was probably some of the earlier criticism of the table, that snipers sitting high probably had very long fields of view across a good chunk of the table. To try and address that, I had played with the way in which the shadows work, so that even though a high deployed unit has great visibility, and you can see on the left-hand side there that right gill missile launcher taking cover at the back behind a duct. Ideally there's opportunities to advance down the table. Look, I think for a first cut it worked pretty well. It is probably a little bit on the lighter side. You can see there where I've done the ladders in bright yellow to really indicate transitions between levels and make it clear for a player moving across the table or up and down the table how they can get access to those levels. But it did play a little bit islandy, and because of that height interaction, it meant that people were not using the bridges that much.
Yep.
I made a couple of key changes.
Well, would we like to move on? We have the Border Bash variant.
Yeah. So you can see here 2 things that I did. One was I changed the way in which I used a lot of the vent systems. So there's fewer vents that are facing forward. They tend to face side on or at the back. And that restricted the amount of cover that people could take on the roofs from those deployment zones. I also played with the angling of the buildings a little bit more. So you'll see that they sort of cascade in waves diagonally across the table.
Yes.
Which what that does, and it's hard to get a visual from this side of it, but those more centrally deployed second layers create a greater shadowing effect, so that there's fewer places for strong arrows, and it meant that you could pivot from left to right easily. Again, I'm using that. You can see a sort of central long wall section snaking through the center of the table diagonally. again, to try and force people to move across, either using the bridges or moving across the table and creating that shadowing space.
Yep. I played on this table at Border Bash, and it played excellent. I didn't really have any major complaints, and it was really good.
One feedback I had was probably that that building in the top of the picture, top center. I think a Zeta got up there for one opponent and had an effilating fire down the flank. Looking at it, it looks okay to me because I think it could have been defended against. But yeah, one player did have a negative experience.
Unfortunately, Zetas can cause negative experiences even with the best tables.
Yeah.
So, Burn City Brawl.
Yes. So this you can see I've changed it up again. It's probably a little.
I feel Jacob's influence already.
Yeah. So this is definitely Jacob's input. You can see there the walls touching the corners of the building and advancing off. So I've actually broken those walls up, created more flow to the table so that the walls and interconnecting buildings create more of a channeling system as opposed to an island system. But the doorways and access through those walls meant that they didn't really block it off. So it created a lot of really interesting engagement aspects. I think people still complain that it's that there were some long lanes. I have a view that DZ to DZ lanes should exist, but shouldn't dominate the table. They should be in narrower spaces. It probably is a little bit lighter on the deployment zone scenery. You can see that certainly here, albeit...
There is a reason for that, because the first round of BCB was the one with the stupid deployment zones that I forget the name of. Power Pack.
Power Pack. So I had to sort of adjust for that and create a little bit more...
So you'll see the centres are probably less dense than they ordinarily would be to account for those weird rectangular deployment zones.
Yeah. Very much a setup where we looked at it and tried to make it so that it favoured probably one side slightly more than the other. But yeah, look, I think overall this is probably the better version of it. The one takeaway I had, and I decided after this particular setup, was to say, okay, I really want to bulk out the terrain a bit more and give players an opportunity to have more density, because that felt like it was losing a little bit of the narrative experience. It felt a little sparse. So I wanted to sort of build up a bit of the volume.
As we have done.
Yes, here. So this one is with the additional set of larger footprint buildings. Now, the only challenge with this is that it was set up with an objective room in mind, that central piece. So it's probably a little bit unusual, but you can see that the density has definitely been uplifted. There's a lot more interplay with height. And because of that, a lot more interesting shadowing opportunities. There was definitely greater interaction on top of the buildings. So that was certainly the evolution of this, that those second layers were used a lot more frequently by players.
Yeah, absolutely. You can definitely tell that you'd have more interaction between, like if you wanted to put something here, it's not seeing, like there's enough second story rooftops that's cutting lines of fire from the first story rooftops that those ARO pieces aren't now dominating the entire set of the second story.
Scatter's really simple, just simple jersey barricades, and then the ducting that sits off the side of the buildings.
Yep. It might, like the previous versions probably didn't look as dense as they played. Yeah, this looks dense and plays denser than the previous ones.
Yeah, and I've played around with it a little bit more subsequently with the additional buildings. It probably is a little bit on the denser side if you use all of the buildings.
But it's good to have the options.
Yeah, it's options. The great thing, again, about these brittle cities, but this is all brittle cities, and the great things about this table is that it all nests. So those roofs come off and the smaller buildings drop into the bigger buildings. So I get that into that smaller container.
Yep. Which is just a boon. All right, this is Hugh's proposed discussion. Give it to me.
Yeah. So if we flick back to the previous slide, so Luke, you mentioned like that you wanted to see a splash of color in the scene, which fantastic, good impulse. Did you start with I want to see more color? How am I going to put color on a table, and then built out from there? What was the
Yeah, yeah,
tell us that
definitely.
story?
Yeah, well, when I set out, the first thing I was really drawn to the buildings. I'm not as brave as you, Hugh, and I tend to go with the more right-angled buildings. And the idea of having a portable table that could nest and have a lot of interesting detail really drew me to these buildings. So um, I think when Ryan came down to BCB one year, I put in a big order and got that first cut of them. So I sort of said to my brother Peter, I really want to do something that's got a sort of Blade Runner vibe, playing into a bit of that sort of cyberpunk sort of synth interaction, and that's how we sort of set about setting the color palette. My original cut of these was the MTN 94 rattle cans. I had a couple of different shades of pink and a couple of different shades of blue, and Peter and I just playing around with the color palette got us the idea of, rather than doing individual buildings in different colors of pink and blue, we go with this fade approach, which is all freehand rattle can that is again using a slow flow graffiti cap over MDF painted black, and then all flat pack, so none of it assembled, put down flat, and then using a slow flow graffiti cap to shade the color in. If you look at it closely, it looks a little bit rough, but gee, you'd have to be looking at it real close.
No one ever would.
And
No.
realistically, if you had the process in your head already, if you're going to make this table again, I don't think it would take you very long to get this effect.
No, not at all. In fact, when I painted the second batch of buildings, I did it in about 2 hours.
Yeah. Which means if you kind of know what you're doing, you've described the process, you get two kind of fluory colors that you like and a slow flow cap, you can paint a whole table in a day, and then the next day you put it together, and realistically you're looking at 5 or 6 colors in total.
Yeah.
Super easy and an incredible effect.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much. I think I would definitely go with the sub assembly if you can. So painting it, take it out, pop it out of the sprue, batch your buildings together, consider the walls, and then get it all painted up. You can always come back with an airbrush later on if you want to add more detail on, or decals are great as well for that if you want to break it up and a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm interested that it's such a sort of materials and tools forward that it's a okay. I want to change the color palette of a tournament.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's super interesting, because I think my own process is very much play outcomes first, where I go, okay, I want to go back to the bouldering analogy. We want this body position. We want someone to have the experience of unpicking a core. How do we give them that? Well, okay, first you need to put somewhere appealing to deploy a core link on the table.
Yep.
And then you need to give access avenues, and then you need to also make the game playable. And so I think I think I usually sketch out my tables, whether it's marking on my MDF boards where the objectives are, and then playing with existing terrain pieces that I have, or doing it in a sketchbook. But the first step is that matrix of, well, where do the objectives go? What do we want to have happen to the objectives?
Yeah,
Tristan,
absolutely.
what's your...
I'm a bit more freeball. When it comes to most tables, pretty much every table I've had except the Warsaw table, but even that to an extent is very modular. Nothing's really it's not like your jungle table where, you know, these cliffs are always going to be in this part of the table no matter what. The objective room's kind of always going to be in the center, the river's always going to be on the other side. I make a table and then I look at it and go blah 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 blah. Does this work? Does this not work? This looks a bit crap, and then I change it. Unfortunately, I think some of you guys might have experienced, it took me about 2 hours to first set up that Warsaw table at Border Bash because I was not fucking happy with it and I just couldn't put it together. So that is a table that I'm really interested in, also considering N5 to try and formalize a setup for it. Because now we have to consider vehicles, we have to consider super jump basically being double movement from what it was. And we have to consider weaker AROs, developing more ablative ARO positions.
I definitely can sympathise with that, Tristan. You know, I tend to work with the modular approach, and I don't know if we've got a photo of my hack table.
I can pull one up that you won't see, but the viewers will see.
Yeah, and that was a table that Pete and I have worked on over the years. It's a table that you can really quickly set up wrong, and I think I mentioned earlier it was set up wrong for BCB this year, but it was a table that I set out. I love those Warsaw buildings; they look so great.
Yeah, it's a very pretty table.
Yeah, that's one best table at CanCon 1 year, a few years back, and a lot of time went into that between rattle canning, airbrushing, masking. Masking's a great way to get detail on.
Masking's a bitch.
It takes a lot of time. Yeah,
it fucking sucks ass. I would rather, if someone has an airbrush, don't mask. Get like a piece of paper or a piece of card and just block out, cover what you don't want to do, because fuck masking.
Look, I'm quick with masking. Peter's even quicker, and
I guess practice makes perfect.
It does, yeah. It depends how much you hate unjamming a clogged airbrush. But yeah, look, that's a table that plays really well now, and it very much it takes a few iterations. One thing I recommend, and I haven't done for that hack table, but I encourage people, is take a photo of like a really great optimal setup that you found works, and chuck that in the box so that anyone that's setting it up, particularly if you're not setting it up, can pull the buildings out and just chuck them down and get the bones of the table set up quickly in a playable format.
Yeah. One of the things that really appealed, the reason I didn't get this training, because I knew you had it, that the thing that really appeals to me, and you mentioned it before, is it is irregular shapes, and it's useful in different ways. Like there's
super interactive.
Most of them are like, if the interior is playable, it's open topped at that part. There's staircases in the middle of it. There's weird overly shapes with second stories built into the building. Staircases are in weird spots. It's just really interesting shapes that not only play well, but breathe table into, make the table feel like it really is some kind of Middle Eastern city.
Yeah. It probably the only thing I don't like about it is that the buildings can be a bit islandy, and there's not really an easy way to get bridges on and off them.
I can see that.
We do have some bridges on there. They're from Wildlands Terrain.
Yep.
Who is a really great, really affordable Ukrainian-based.
If anyone wants to go look at Wildlands, his terrain is very unique and pretty cheap and pretty awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, that's I really enjoy playing on that table. I've probably played on it a few too many times now, that, but it plays really well, and I think the feedback generally, if it's been set up well, is that people love playing on those Warsaw buildings.
Yeah. All right. Not sure what I say. Table recommendations. So we kind of said a little bit of bad things about them, but Micro Art Studios, if you want It's basically what I would call CB Card Plus. It has, it's squarey shapes. It has really interesting shapes, kind of like the Huck table, but more standard. So it has like staircases in the middle of a building. This building's slightly longer and has a little portable thing. It does have standard buildings where there's one staircase and it's a block and all that kind of stuff. But if you want a table that you know you can set up relatively simply and it will play really well, it's already painted for you. I think this is one of the ways to go if you want to spend a little bit more money and not buy CB Card Terrain. We have one of these in Victoria, and I actually love playing on it, even if it isn't the most thematic looking table.
Yeah, the other a similar option is local venue gaming arena is producing a similar like printed MDF thing, and they've made a couple of designs specifically for Infinity that play pretty good. They're very similar to the CB card.
They are exactly the same as the CB card.
Not quite, because you can get a 40mm up the stairs.
That's because they haven't accounted for the fact that their things are a little bit... They might have done that on purpose. I think maybe they have done it on purpose. But that is definitely an option. I don't think you can't buy it just yet. Yeah. In the future, you will be able to purchase it if you're local to Victoria and you want one of those tables. It's definitely robust. Like if you want a table that's never going to break, that is a table to buy. And
there are a few other pre-printed providers. I know MicroArts does a couple of different styles.
Yeah. I picked my favorite. You can go and check out their website. The other ones are a bit more simple and will require a lot more scatter.
You can also get a feel for it by playing on TTS, because I think
there's a
MicroArt got very involved, or someone who had a shitload of MicroArt was very involved in that, like 3D scanning.
So you can actually, if you have TTS, you can go into TTS, you can get the buildings, and you can make your table in TTS before you purchase it to decide if you want it or not, and what parts, like what modulars you want to buy. They do have like a big terrain kit. I'll probably recommend getting a little bit more than that, but regardless, gets my recommendation. I want one of their tables. We've been talking about them a lot. Warsenal. I've put up here one of the lines of Warsenal that we don't have, and it's the Cosmica line. And it is basically the indoor, if you want an indoor table without the roofs, this is the stuff you want to get. Kind of like the table we're seeing here. So the first one, MicroArt Studio, is based in Poland. So if you're in Europe, it's good for you. Warsenal is based in America. So if you're in America, it's great for you. If you're anywhere else, it's going to cost a bomb. But it is hyper detailed, almost to the point where you're going to hate painting it because it is so detailed. It's like as detailed as the goddamn models.
The Warsenal ones, they do take a lot more paint time.
They take a way longer to build too.
Yeah.
Ages to build. But if you really deck it out, it has the potential to just be ridiculously pretty and functional as well.
And they do a pre-printed series. They've got more of that coming out.
Yep.
If you're not into the hobby side of terrain, it is. Yeah, it's getting up there though.
It's definitely cash money, but it's better than 95% of people who are going to paint it. It's really nice. Miniature Scenery. Australia-based. Currently, Scorched Earth is on a small hiatus until sometime next year. But Miniature Scenery is great because as Luke alludes, their terrain is great for Infinity. It's actually really cheap for what it is.
Absolutely.
And they have the potential of doing what you can see in this picture here, where you have like, you don't get a mat, but you have like a battle board, and you can customize that as well.
Yeah.
And get like, this table's really complicated. This was one of their demo tables at I think House of War back in the day, but they have risers, they have really cool looking staircase things, they have dips in the board itself, so there's almost like an underground level. There's lots of stuff you can do here, and this is like, this would cost a lot of money, but this looks thematic as hell.
Yeah, you don't need to go to this level from their stuff.
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
But
they
goddamn,
do a
does it
couple
look
of
good.
different ranges. This city-based one is beautiful, but it's a lot of MDF.
It's a lot of
Well,
work.
and I'd say though those tower buildings are of their line perhaps least suited to Infinity in that
Yeah.
those are islands. They cast long shadows, but they're very
Narrow.
they produce very binary play states of like can that tower see you? If so, you fucked. I do really like how they're particularly their sort of mid-sized scatter. You can see one of their vehicles in yellow in the right-hand corner. They do such interesting shapes that, like, they're a bit fiddly to put together sometimes, but they produce effects that don't feel like MDF. It's like, oh no, actually, with a little bit of sanding, I can get a rounded, coherent surface that looks like the body of a vehicle, rather than here are 36 little grid lines.
Yep.
And that, yeah, very exciting stuff.
Very nice. If you're Australia based, that's great. Battle Kiwi, New Zealand based. They have, this is some of their old stuff that's very Infinity based. They have a new stuff. All their stuff is pre-printed white. So if you peel it off, you get a table that looks like this without doing anything. Which,
or if you peel some of it off, it's pre-masked.
It's it's all pre-masked if you want to do that, which is a great boon. I'm guessing if you don't live in New Zealand, it might be slightly expensive, but it is definitely an option, and it is one of the only options in the Australia region of getting cool tokens and battle wallets and all that kind of thing, aside from Scorched Earth, which is really great. I'm not sure if any of us have played on too much Battle Kiwi stuff.
I've got a little bit of this stuff. It wasn't super expensive to get to Australia, but yeah, it paints up really well. It's good.
It's options.
There's an Aristea table that
there is.
I saw at Novacore that is one of it. Like, so we talked before about the valleying effect, where you don't want lots of different things that look down onto somewhere, and a stadium is literally exactly that, even though the Hexadome has cover internally. But that table really set my mind ablaze around, like, well, how do you, okay, you've got this problem, which is that you have a stadium. How do you play with a stadium? How do you make, the tops of the grandstands relevant? How do you make the field, and then the sort of diorama-ish ticketing booths and changing rooms and parking lot that are presumptively around the stadium? Like, how do you make that playable? And I definitely wasn't there at the last Novacore, but I had a go, and it was really fun. And I think that's probably the tipping point of me really being interested in terrain as a puzzle.
Yep. I remember the first BCB Jacob and myself went to had the Hexadome table, and Jacob got paired against other Jacob on that table, and Kevin had to come over and explained for about 10 minutes how to play the table, and that this little spot through the Hexadome, like, ignore that, because if you can see through that, the whole table's fucked. And don't do this. And yeah, it needed more than a card. It needed a TO to explain to every person on it how to play it properly.
And that's not viable on a 2-dayer.
Yeah.
You don't... It was fine if...
I found it fun to play on. I've played on a few times.
It's fine if you kind of do it. If you got it round 5 against some factions, you might be like, this feels a bit brutal. But yeah. Again, great provider of terrain. Go for it if you want. Final thoughts. Is there anything you guys would like to add?
What's your next tables?
I know Ryan from Brutal Cities is opening up his his store again for a short amount of time. So I might be tempted to get something from him. I really loved the demo table we had at, I forget the name of the event, but it was a charity event in Canberra. And it was Anzac Cup. Yes, it was the table with all the helicopter pads and the ocean floor and the new style stuff. Yeah, I think you can see pictures of it on his website. That exact demo table. It was really nice. It was really simple to paint and different.
Luke, have we got enough color yet?
Yeah. Well, just wait and see, Hugh. I've got 2 projects in a way. I'm actually I'm stepping sideways to play a little bit of Necromunda for a bit. So I've got a table of Scorched Earth Necromunda terrain that I'm working on as a palette cleanser. That I'm tossing up whether I sort of blend it in and make an infinity table out of it. I've been threatening a Ready Player One-esque container/junkyard table that I started the project back in COVID era, and it's about halfway through, and I've got a lot of widgets that I've part painted. So that will. I'm hoping that I'll be able to get that out. I was hoping for this CanCon, but it'll probably be BCB next year.
Next year or this year?
2025.
2025. Okay, so like
does that still count as next year?
Yeah, sure. We'll take it. Because you're giving yourself the caveat then of I've actually got a year and 9 months. It's not. I meant next BCB.
9 months. Look, I've done a lot of work on it already, but it's 40 containers and a lot of scaffolding.
Yeah.
So that will be interesting. And then Pete and I are looking at our stash, and we've got some risers from Loz Block, which I think they might be Russian based. So it's a bastard to get access to them at the moment. But we've got some awesome like shop front risers that we want to sort of hit and paint up with a view to doing a bit of a remix of our existing tables and trying to freshen it up for people, so that some of those tables have been in circulation for 5+ years on my show mate here, closer to 10, and probably mixing it up and blending these in might give it a new lease of life and give people a different experience.
Sick.
All right, Hugh, what's the next grand plan?
It's a hedge maze. We don't have a bug hunt table in Melbourne, and I think, there's a reason they call it hubris. I think I'm the guy to make a bug hunt table that people don't fucking hate.
You're just slowly going to go to more crazy ideas.
Look, I have a mate of mine who doesn't play Infinity, but hears my terrain ramblings, wants to do a table that is mid-earthquake that changes between turns 2 and 3. Ooh. Like a building is like hinged and some parts are on runners, and it's more of like a cute little automaton than a playable table, but I'll try not to bring too much of that to a tournament.
I think that's one step too far.
Potentially. Well, never move the terrain.
Yep. All right, people in the chat, does anyone have any final questions for our guests about tables? I will give you 30 seconds.
One quick one.
Oh, yep.
Tristan, just throw it out there. We've just covered a lot of like MDF providers through here. There's a lot of 3D printing coming online. We're seeing more and more of. I think it's might be Stack City. Again, another Australian-based STL designer that has some really cool stuff.
Yep. Another one is Saucerman Studios.
Yeah, Saucerman.
That's a really popular one.
So there's a few more out there. I don't do 3D printing myself, so I haven't used it a lot. I've probably brought more in terms of like scatter terrain for vehicles, crates, and those barricades.
Yep.
But there's some, yeah, the hobby is really evolving, and there's some really great stuff you can get.
You can definitely,
Online.
if you can, for the Warsaw table, I 3D printed all the scatter,
Yeah.
which was it wasn't actually as cost effective because I was using resin. So I spent about $60 worth of resin to get all that scatter, including failures. But FDM is cheap as chips, and you can print whole buildings at a time. So if you really have a month, if you want to dedicate a month of printing time to a table, you can get a really nice table. You won't be able to do what you guys do and paint it sub-assembly, obviously, but it'll be very nice. Tim says, when arraying your terrain, angled or horizontal? Well, it depends.
Yeah, I think we covered it a bit earlier.
We did cover it a little bit earlier. Horizontal is easier to defend. Angled gives you that it's less hard to move out of your DZ with angled terrain. You're not as stopped by going around the building. But the angled really does need that scatter on the buildings to kind of create that arrow pointing away from your DZ to give you those little nooks to hide away. Either, honestly.
You can don't feel like you've got to go 45 degrees. Like,
yes, that's a big thing.
30 degrees probably cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I've most of my tables, most of my fixed layouts are square to the grid, whereas particularly that blue riser table, card table, I really like for a more casual or just like, oh yeah, let's just throw some stuff out and see what happens. I really like an angled layout. I think it's easier to dial in a square table and harder to go wrong with an angled one.
Yeah.
Does that seem like a reasonable thesis statement?
Yeah. I mean, you get some great advantages for things like bridges, because it tends to be more difficult to shoot directly down a bridge that's oriented directly into the middle of the table.
Yep.
So it can make it a little bit easier.
Nick says angles don't have to be uniform across the table, which is very true. They might blow your OCD a little bit.
It sounds upsetting.
But it is
I
definitely...
can't do that.
It's definitely... I can admit that I can use buildings on... If all buildings are on an angle, I can have like some square buildings, some on an angle. So I can do some facing directly forwards, some on an angle, but all the buildings on an angle have to be on the same angle. Otherwise, it annoys me a little bit.
Yeah, you see a few tournaments where it feels like they've just dropped buildings onto the table, and the challenge is if they're all at different angles, it can create really closed off environments because of the angle of the building, and then really, really open environments where it's hard to get cover. So I think if you're going to do it, I would say probably stick to a bulk of it, on right angles, and then just orientate some buildings on 45 degrees.
Yeah, I'd say pick two orientations for buildings.
Yeah,
because then it's purposeful variety rather than, oh, sorry, I tripped and all my terrain fell on the table. Have fun.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, you want it to be able to be assessed. It sort of comes back to this idea of it being a cinematic experience. And easy for players to interact with the table.
I think that's the big thing as well. If I'm having to look at each piece of terrain and recalculate the angle and what that angle is kind of good for, I'm sitting here going, if I look at my DZ and I assume all my buildings are the same angle that my opponent's DZ are, and I don't really check my opponent's DZ, and I walk across the table and go, oh, fuck, they're like way tighter than my DZs. They're still on an angle, but like way tighter. It's going to take me, I'm going to pop around the corner. It's going to be harder for me or whatever. Yeah. Try and maintain the same angle. It keeps everyone sane. Alrighty. No more questions. So 3 hours, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for you two coming on and talking about terrain.
That's a pleasure.
Thanks for
Hopefully we've given everyone some interesting perspectives and covered off some key points.
Absolutely. If you take nothing from this episode except put scatter on your tables, please. Pretty please.
And paint them and put a mat underneath
and paint them.
Have a go.
Yeah, just have a go. If you're worried about your table is not going to be painted very well or whatever. Trust me, any color is better than no color. Even if it's all gray with like 3 shades from a rattle can, it's good.
Yeah, feedback's good, and don't be. I think the internet can be a really sour place for people that sort of jump online and look at tournament tables and go, "Oh, that's I can't believe people put that up." It's like, well,
one
from my
picture,
perspective,
one picture on Facebook does not tell the story of a table.
no, doesn't play it how it plays, and also get fucked. Someone's put a lot of effort and time into getting that to the table and having a go. So I think that's really important.
Well, and I guess we'd rather play a game of Infinity around an iPhone box than not play a game of Infinity.
Exactly. Yeah. So if it's a real, the one last thing I want to say, it's you are doing a service to your community, dedicating yourself to have a table. Infinity tables are not cheap. They're not easy to move around, and you need it to play the game. So anyone who out there who is a table creator, I salute you. You do a service for your community. You let the game be played, and you let it grow to the popularity that it has. So yeah, thank you guys for joining me, and we'll see you on the next episode. Good night, everyone.